The Force binds all things across the galaxy, connecting every living being in an invisible web of energy that flows through stars, planets, and the space between. For 1,000 generations, the Jedi have served as guardians of this mystical power, interpreting its will and maintaining balance. But what happens when something arrives that exists entirely outside the Force? A being whose very presence creates a void in the cosmic tapestry, whose power stems not from midi-chlorians or ancient philosophy, but from the cold, immutable laws of quantum mechanics? The phenomenon began as a distortion in Coruscant's upper atmosphere, precisely 47,000 kilometers above the Galactic Senate building. Sensors across the ecumenopolis registered the anomaly simultaneously, a localized disruption of space-time that defied every known principle of hyperspace travel. No ship signature, no sublight engine burn, no gravitational wake from real space entry, simply arrival. The figure that coalesced into reality was humanoid in shape but utterly alien in composition. He stood 3 meters tall, his skin glowing with bioluminescent blue radiance that pulsed with atomic energy. Completely naked, utterly unbothered by the vacuum of space, he floated in the void as comfortably as a man might stand on solid ground. His face bore an expression of profound detachment, not hostile, not friendly, simply observing with eyes that seemed to look through matter itself, seeing the fundamental particles that comprised everything around him. Dr. Jonathan Osterman had not chosen to come here. Choice implied volition, and volition implied linearity of time. He existed simultaneously in the moment of his arrival, in his past as a human scientist, and in multiple potential futures spreading before him like quantum probability clouds. He was observing the fundamental structure of reality when dimensional barriers proved more permeable than expected. Now he existed here, in a galaxy he'd never heard of, surrounded by technology he could disassemble with a thought and reconstruct with another. Below him, Coruscant sprawled across an entire planet's surface, 5 trillion beings packed into kilometer-high structures, their lives intersecting in patterns of commerce, politics, and conflict. He could see them all if he wished, perceive every conversation, every heartbeat, every atomic bond holding their bodies together. But what drew his attention was something else entirely. Energy, not electromagnetic radiation or nuclear force, but something that flowed through certain individuals like electric current through conductive material. It connected them in ways his quantum perception struggled to quantify. Biological organisms carrying unusual concentrations of microscopic symbiotic life forms, midi-chlorians, his atomic vision informed him, that seemed to channel this mysterious energy, and those beings were aware of him. In the Jedi Temple, Master Yoda's meditation was shattered by a presence that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. The ancient Jedi's eyes snapped open, his connection to the Force screaming warnings about something fundamentally wrong with reality itself. Beside him, Mace Windu felt it too. A void, an absence, a place where the Force simply stopped flowing as though encountering an insurmountable barrier. Felt that, did you? Yoda's voice carried centuries of experience processing impossible phenomena. This was different from Sith darkness or technological interference. This was something the Force itself recoiled from. A disturbance, Windu confirmed, rising from his meditation posture. But not in the Force. It's as if the Force is disturbed by something that shouldn't exist. Dr. Manhattan observed their awareness of him with detached curiosity. These beings could sense his presence despite the vast distance and multiple layers of matter between them. Fascinating. He began descending through Coruscant's atmosphere, his body phasing through solid matter as easily as light through transparent steel. Starfighters on patrol flew directly through his form without making contact. He simply reorganized his atomic structure around their trajectory. The Jedi Temple's communication arrays lit up with emergency protocols. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine's office received simultaneous alerts from a dozen security agencies. In the Senate building, politicians argued about appropriate responses to an unidentified entity approaching the heart of the Republic. On factory worlds across separatist space, Count Dooku received reports from deep-cover intelligence operatives about something that had every Jedi in the temple mobilized. Manhattan materialized on one of the temple's high landing platforms, his bare feet touching stone for the first time since his arrival. Around him, clone troopers raised their DC-15 blasters, the weapons trained on center mass despite obvious futility. He could perceive the identical genetic structure of each soldier, see the accelerated aging in their cellular composition, understand the behavioral modification chips embedded in their cerebral cortexes. "Identify yourself," the commander barked, his finger tight on the trigger despite the tremor in his voice. Every instinct screamed that this glowing blue figure was a threat beyond his comprehension. Dr. Manhattan regarded the trooper with eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of stars. "I am Dr. Jonathan Osterman. I did not intend to come here. I am uncertain if intention remains a meaningful concept given my current state of temporal perception." The Jedi who emerged from the temple's interior were led by Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker, their lightsabers unignited but hands resting on the hilts. Kenobi's diplomatic instincts warred with the overwhelming wrongness his force sensitivity detected. Anakin's mechanical hand clenched reflexively, the force whispering warnings about danger while simultaneously insisting there was no danger to sense. "You're not from this galaxy," Kenobi said carefully, making its statement rather than question. "I am from a different reality entirely," Manhattan confirmed. "Your galaxy is undergoing significant military conflict. 3.2 million clone soldiers deployed across 40,000 systems, approximately 2.1 trillion droids in active combat service. Statistical models suggest 97.3% probability of Republic victory within 18 to 36 months, though my precognition is experiencing unusual interference." Anakin's eyes narrowed. "How do you know our troop numbers?" "That's classified intelligence. I can perceive atomic structures, your droid's power signatures, the clone facilities on Camino, the Senate's encrypted databases." Manhattan tilted his head slightly. "Privacy appears to be a significant concern in your society. I find the concept of hidden information quaint." Before tensions could escalate, Master Yoda arrived, his small form somehow commanding more presence than the towering blue giant. The ancient Jedi studied Manhattan with eyes that had seen 900 years of galactic history and found himself looking at something entirely new. "Beyond the Force, you exist," Yoda observed quietly. "A question this raises: possible is such existence, or an illusion? Are you?" Manhattan considered the question with the same detachment he'd applied to nuclear physics in his previous life. "I exist across multiple quantum states simultaneously. Your force is a phenomenon I can observe, but not interact with. A form of energy that appears to operate on principles fundamentally different from those governing my existence. You perceive me as void because I am not connected to your mystical energy field. I am merely matter, reorganized with perfect understanding of its quantum nature." The Jedi exchanged glances weighted with implications. A being with godlike power who existed outside the Force's guidance, outside its balance, outside its will. In the middle of the Clone Wars, such an entity could tip the scales in ways no one could predict, and in his hidden sanctum, Darth Sidious felt Dr. Manhattan's arrival like a disruption in a carefully orchestrated symphony. His visions of the future, so clear for decades, suddenly clouded with probability fractals he'd never encountered. The plan, Order 66, the fall of the Jedi, the birth of the Empire, all of it now existed in states of quantum uncertainty. For the first time in years, the Dark Lord of the Sith felt something he'd long forgotten: doubt. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. Dr. Manhattan stood motionless on the temple platform, his atomic perception absorbing everything. The city planet's electromagnetic spectrum, the thermal patterns of 5 trillion lives, the gravitational anomalies of massive orbital structures. But what fascinated him most were the beings before him, who somehow sensed his presence through a force he couldn't feel, who looked at him with expressions mixing fear, curiosity, and something that might have been hope. He had not experienced hope in a very long time. The Jedi Council chamber had witnessed countless debates over the millennia, discussions of war strategy, philosophical disputes, judgments on those who'd fallen to the dark side. But none of the 12 masters seated in their appointed chairs had ever confronted a being quite like the one who stood at the chamber's center, glowing with ethereal blue light that cast strange shadows across the circular room. Dr. Manhattan had not walked to the council chamber. He had simply ceased to exist on the landing platform and begun existing here, his matter reorganizing instantaneously across the intervening space. The Jedi had felt the displacement, not through the Force, which remained eerily silent regarding this entity, but through the sudden absence and reappearance of a massive quantum signature that their senses struggled to process. Teleportation without technology, Ki-Adi-Mundi observed, his multiple brain lobes working to categorize the phenomenon. Not force-based translocation, something else entirely. Manhattan studied each council member with vision that penetrated flesh, bone, and the ornate chairs they occupied. He could see Yoda's unusual cellular structure, the extra centuries written in telomere degradation patterns. Mace Windu's synthetic right hand, the kyber crystal in the lightsaber at his belt humming with organized energy that his atomic perception recognized as matter held in an exotic plasma state. Plo Koon's breathing apparatus filtering Coruscant's oxygen-rich atmosphere into something his Keldor physiology could process. "You perceive us in ways we do not perceive ourselves," Yoda said, his ancient voice carrying both curiosity and wariness. "Yet blind to the Force, you remain. A puzzle, this is. Your Force is energy generated by living organisms, channeled through microscopic symbionts you call midichlorians," Manhattan replied, his voice resonating with harmonic frequencies. "I observe their quantum behavior but cannot interact with the energy they produce. It operates on principles outside conventional physics, a form of reality manipulation that consciousness itself appears to guide." Obi-Wan Kenobi, standing as witness rather than council member, stroked his beard thoughtfully. "You speak of the Force as if it's a scientific phenomenon to be studied rather than a spiritual truth to be embraced." "All phenomena can be studied," Manhattan said. "The distinction between spiritual and physical is arbitrary. Your Force manipulates probability, accelerates cellular healing, enables precognition through quantum entanglement of possible futures. These are measurable effects, regardless of the philosophy you've constructed around them." Anakin Skywalker, also present as witness, felt his fists clench. There was something deeply unsettling about this being's clinical detachment. The way he discussed the Force as though it were no more sacred than a chemical reaction. The Force isn't just energy. It has a will. It guides us, connects us. It's alive. Manhattan turned his luminous eyes toward Anakin, and for a moment the young Jedi felt utterly transparent, as if every atom of his being were being cataloged and analyzed. "You carry unusual midichlorian concentrations, over 20,000 per cell, significantly beyond normal parameters. Your mother's pregnancy showed no biological father contribution, parthenogenesis facilitated by midichlorian manipulation of her reproductive system. You are, in essence, created by this Force you worship." The council chamber fell into shocked silence. Anakin's conception had been a closely guarded secret, known only to the highest echelons of the Jedi Order. That this stranger could perceive such intimate biological details with a glance was both violation and revelation. "Dangerous knowledge, that is," Yoda said quietly. "See too much, you do. Understand too little." "I understand that you are engaged in a war you believe yourselves to be winning," Manhattan replied. "I perceive 1.7 million clone soldiers on active deployment, another 1.5 million in accelerated development on Camino. Your separatist opponents field 2.1 trillion battle droids across manufacturing centers on Geonosis, Hypori, and 47 additional foundry worlds. Numerically, you are vastly outnumbered." Mace Windu leaned forward, his expression hardening. "And yet we continue to achieve victories. The Force guides our strategies. We are not mere calculators measuring odds." "Your victories follow patterns," Manhattan observed. "Strategic leadership by Force-sensitive commanders produces success rates 340% higher than conventional military doctrine would predict. Your precognition allows you to anticipate enemy movements. This is your primary tactical advantage." He paused, and for the first time, something like uncertainty crossed his features. However, I am detecting anomalies in galactic probability streams. Events that should resolve with mathematical certainty instead exist in quantum superposition. Someone is manipulating fate itself. The statement hung in the air like a death sentence. Several council members exchanged glances weighted with unspoken concerns. Yoda's ears lowered slightly, and Mace Windu's jaw tightened. Elaborate on these anomalies, Windu commanded, his tone leaving no room for evasion. Manhattan's form flickered, and suddenly there were three of him, each identical, each occupying a different position in the chamber. The Jedi's hands instinctively moved toward their lightsabers before recognizing this was demonstration, not attack. I exist across multiple quantum states simultaneously. The three Manhattans spoke in perfect unison. I perceive time non-linearly, past, present, and probable futures existing as a single continuum. Since arriving in your galaxy 17 minutes ago, I have attempted to trace probability streams forward. The three figures merged back into one. Your war's outcome shifts unpredictably. One moment, I observe the Republic victorious with the Jedi Order intact. The next moment, I see your entire order destroyed, your temple burning, your philosophy extinct. Obi-Wan felt cold dread settle in his stomach. The Sith, you're seeing the dark side's influence on the future. I see coordinated manipulation by a singular consciousness operating within your government structure. Manhattan corrected. A being who exists in multiple probability states simultaneously. Not through quantum mechanics as I do, but through mastery of your force. Someone who has engineered this entire conflict as a mechanism for achieving a predetermined outcome. The council chamber erupted in controlled chaos. Questions fired from multiple masters simultaneously, voices overlapping in urgent demands for clarification. But Yoda raised one small hand, and silence fell immediately. The Sith Lord we seek, the ancient master said slowly. Close to us he is, closer than we knew. See him, can you? Manhattan's eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the physical chamber, perceiving layers of reality the Jedi could only sense through their mystical connection. There is a concentration of dark side energy in the Senate District, a consciousness that warps probability around itself like a gravitational field bends space-time. When I attempt to perceive his future actions, I encounter deliberate obfuscation, probability fractals designed to confuse precognitive observation. Can you identify this individual? Windu demanded, rising from his seat. No, Manhattan admitted, and the word carried unexpected weight coming from a near-omniscient being. His mastery of the Force creates quantum uncertainty around his identity. I observe multiple possible identities superimposed upon each other. Until I directly interact with him, the waveform will not collapse into certainty. Anakin stepped forward, his mechanical hand clenching and unclenching. Then you could help us. You're outside the Force, outside his manipulation. You could see through the deception that's blinded us. For the first time since his arrival, Dr. Manhattan hesitated. The Jedi watched as something like internal conflict played across his luminous features, an expression that suggested the being was not as detached as he claimed. I came here by accident, Manhattan said slowly. I did not choose this galaxy, this war, this moment. In my previous existence, I learned that intervention in predetermined events often produces worse outcomes than non-interference. I watched my world slide toward nuclear annihilation despite my power to prevent it. I left because I realized my presence created more problems than it solved. Different, this situation is, Yoda insisted, his voice carrying the weight of 9 centuries of wisdom. An outsider you are, a variable the Sith Lord could not have predicted. Perhaps the Force itself brought you here. Perhaps balance requires one who exists beyond the Force. Manhattan considered this with the same clinical detachment he'd applied to everything since his transformation. But beneath that detachment, buried under layers of quantum consciousness and atomic perception, something stirred. A fragment of the man he'd once been, who had loved and lost, who had felt connection before omniscience isolated him from humanity. I will observe, he finally declared. I will not intervene without understanding the full scope of consequences, but I will watch and I will learn about this force that defies my comprehension. The council accepted this compromise with varying degrees of satisfaction. As Manhattan prepared to teleport away, Obi-Wan called out one final question. Dr. Manhattan, in your observation of possible futures, do you see us winning this war? The blue giant paused at the chamber's threshold, his form already beginning to dematerialize. I see multiple endings. In some, you triumph. In others, you are utterly destroyed. But in all probable futures, I observe one constant. The boy with 20,000 midichlorians stands at the center of galactic transformation. Whatever fate awaits your order, Anakin Skywalker will be the fulcrum upon which it turns. Then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of ozone and a council chamber full of Jedi who suddenly felt far less certain about their understanding of destiny. Across the Senate district, in an ornate office decorated with artifacts from 1,000 worlds, Chancellor Palpatine sat motionless in his chair. His aged face betrayed nothing, but his mind worked furiously behind a mask of political serenity. Through the dark side, he'd felt the quantum being's analysis, the cold calculation that had nearly pierced veils Sidious had spent decades weaving. Nearly, but not quite. The Sith Lord smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who'd just discovered unexpected prey in his carefully prepared trap. This Dr. Manhattan was powerful, yes, potentially even dangerous. But he was also isolated, detached, uncertain about intervention. And uncertainty, Palpatine knew, was just another word for manipulable. The Separatist command ship Invisible Hand hung in orbit above the factory world of Hyperi, its massive form casting shadows across the droid foundries below that work ceaselessly to produce the machines of war. In the ship's war room, Count Dooku stood before a holographic display showing the blue figure that had appeared on Coruscant, his elegant features drawn in contemplation. General Grievous loomed beside him, the cyborg's multiple arms twitching with predatory anticipation. This creature, Grievous rasped through his vocabulator. It simply appeared? No ship? No hyperspace signature? According to our intelligence operatives embedded in the Republic military, Dooku confirmed, his cultured voice carrying aristocratic precision, a being of pure energy, capable of matter manipulation, teleportation, and perception beyond anything our sensors can achieve. The Jedi are unsettled by its presence. Dooku's scarred face twisted into something approximating a smile. Then it is a weapon. We must capture it, reverse engineer its power, replicate it across our droid armies. Perhaps, Dooku said slowly, his mind working through layers of strategy his brutish general could never comprehend. Or perhaps it is something more valuable, a piece on the board that neither my master nor the Jedi anticipated. An outside variable in a carefully calculated equation. He turned away from the hologram, hands clasped behind his back in the manner of the Jedi he'd once been. Decades of training in the Force had taught him to sense disturbances in the cosmic order, and this Dr. Manhattan was a disturbance unlike any he'd encountered. Not dark side, not light side, simply other. Through their connection across light years, Dooku felt his master's attention focusing on him like a dark sun's gravity. You sense it too, Darth Sidious's voice echoed in his mind, carried through the Force. The quantum anomaly that exists outside our sight. It threatens your plan, my master, Dooku said aloud, knowing Grievous would assume he spoke through holographic communication. If this being can perceive probability streams as it claims, it might unravel years of careful manipulation. Or, Sidious countered, and Dooku could hear the calculating cruelty in his master's mental voice. It provides opportunity. The Jedi will attempt to use this Manhattan against us. They will place faith in a being that operates outside the Force's guidance. This faith will blind them to dangers they would otherwise sense. Continue with the operation on Christophsis. Let us see how this quantum god responds to the realities of war. The connection severed, leaving Dooku alone with his thoughts and his monstrous general. Through the viewport, Hyperi's foundries glowed like dying stars, each one birthing thousands of battle droids that would die in a war whose true purpose remained hidden from all but two Sith Lords, and perhaps now, one quantum entity who claimed to see everything. Dr. Manhattan materialized on the observation deck of a Republic Star destroyer stationed above Christophsis, the crystalline world currently under Separatist blockade. He had not asked permission to board, had not requested coordinates or clearance codes. He simply decided to exist here, and so he did. Clone troopers shouted in alarm, raising weapons that Manhattan knew would prove utterly ineffective against his atomic structure. But before violence could erupt, Anakin Skywalker strode onto the deck, his hand raised in a calming gesture. "Stand down," Anakin commanded. He's with us, sort of." Manhattan observed the young Jedi with renewed interest. Since their encounter in the council chamber, he had been tracking Anakin's quantum signature across Coruscant, observing behavioral patterns that fascinated him. The boy, no, the man, though barely 20, carried contradictions within his atomic structure. Tremendous power paired with emotional instability. Devotion to the Jedi Code while simultaneously maintaining a secret marriage to Senator Padme Amidala, currently 3 months pregnant with twins. So many secrets for someone who claimed to serve truth. "You followed me," Anakin said. Not quite accusation, but not quite welcome either. "I decided to observe combat operations," Manhattan replied. "You are leading the assault on Christophsis. Statistical analysis suggests a 67% probability of Republic victory, but I wish to observe how the Force influences battlefield outcomes." Below them, the crystalline planet rotated slowly, its surface glittering with geometric formations that refracted starlight into rainbow patterns. Separatist ships formed a defensive perimeter around 3 massive droid factories, while Republic forces gathered for what military doctrine classified as a surgical strike, though Manhattan's analysis suggested nothing surgical about dropping 50,000 clone troopers into urban warfare against entrenched mechanical opponents. Obi-Wan Kenobi emerged from the bridge, his robe still bearing dust from a previous engagement. "Dr. Manhattan, I wasn't aware you'd be joining us." "I go where I choose," Manhattan stated simply. "Your council requested I observe. I am observing." "Wonderful," Obi-Wan muttered, exchanging a glance with Anakin that carried years of partnership and mutual exasperation. "Just try not to disintegrate our troops along with the enemy, would you?" Manhattan tilted his head, processing whether this was humor or genuine concern. "I have not decided to intervene. I am merely watching." The assault began with brutal efficiency. Lat gunships screamed down through Christophsis' atmosphere, deploying clone forces onto crystalline towers that shattered under artillery fire. ATTE walkers lumbered through streets designed for commerce, not warfare, their mass driver cannons reducing droid fortifications to molecular debris. And throughout it all, 2 Jedi, Anakin and Obi-Wan, led from the front, their lightsabers blazing blue and cyan as they carved through battle droid formations with impossible grace. Manhattan watched from his position above the battlefield, his perception simultaneously processing 10,000 individual combat encounters. He saw clone trooper CT-7567 take a blaster bolt to the chest, his armor failing to stop the superheated plasma. The soldier's heart stopped, his brain beginning to die from oxygen deprivation. Manhattan could save him, could reach out across kilometers and reorganize the damaged tissue, restart the cardiac system, reverse the fatal wound. But he did not move. He had learned on Earth that saving individuals often produced cascading consequences he couldn't predict. That soldier's death might be necessary for some larger pattern. His survival might doom others. Manhattan's precognition, already scrambled by the Force's interference, could not calculate which choice produced better outcomes. So he watched as CT-7567 died, his identical brothers stepping over the corpse to continue their advance. On the ground, Anakin felt the death through the Force, one light among millions extinguishing like a candle in a storm. He'd learned to build walls against such constant loss, to focus on victory rather than mourning each individual casualty. But something made him look up, and he saw the blue figure floating kilometers above, watching with detached observation as men died. Rage flared hot in Anakin's chest. This being could stop this, could end the battle with a thought, disintegrate every droid, save every clone. But he just watched, like they were insects under glass, their suffering nothing more than data to be cataloged. A separatist artillery shell screamed toward a cluster of clone troopers. Anakin reached out with the Force, redirecting its trajectory into empty space where it detonated harmlessly. 17 lives saved through quick thinking and powerful connection to the cosmic energy. Dr. Manhattan observed this intervention with analytical interest. The young Jedi had altered probability through will alone, manipulating kinetic vectors faster than conscious thought could process. Fascinating. The Force granted its users the ability to impose desired outcomes onto reality itself, a power that operated on principles his quantum consciousness struggled to categorize. The battle raged for 6 hours of objective time. For Manhattan, who perceived past, present, and future simultaneously, it existed as a single extended moment, a crystalline structure of causality where each death, each decision, each blaster bolt followed deterministic paths from cause to effect. But then something happened that his precognition hadn't predicted. General Grievous arrived. The cyborg general dropped from a separatist landing craft like a mechanical nightmare, his forearms igniting lightsabers stolen from Jedi he'd killed. He moved through clone formations with inhuman speed, his spinning blades creating a defensive barrier that blaster fire couldn't penetrate. Troopers died in pieces, their armor sliced apart by weapons meant for elegant dueling, not industrial slaughter. Anakin and Obi-Wan converged on Grievous's position, their lightsabers meeting his in a storm of plasma and sparks. The duel flowed through the streets with balletic violence, 3 Jedi forms against 1 mechanical terror trained by Count Dooku himself. And then Grievous did something unexpected. He disengaged from combat, his photoreceptors turning skyward to focus on the glowing blue figure floating above the battlefield. "You!" The cyborg's vocabulator screeched across military communication channels. "You are the anomaly, the quantum weapon." Before anyone could respond, Grievous fired a grappling cable from his mechanical chassis, the line shooting upward with impossible range and accuracy. It passed harmlessly through Manhattan's atomic structure, but that had been a feint. The real attack came from 3 separatist gunships that materialized from behind crystalline formations, their weapon systems armed with experimental ion disruptors designed to disable Force users' nervous systems. The weapons fired simultaneously, unleashing electromagnetic pulses that would have paralyzed any biological target. They passed through Dr. Manhattan without effect. He didn't even blink. "Interesting," Manhattan observed as the gunships adjusted for a second volley. "You assume I am vulnerable to electromagnetic interference? I am not. I am the electromagnetic force. I am gravity. I am the strong nuclear force holding atomic nuclei together. Your weapons are composed of the very forces I control." He raised one hand, and reality obeyed. The 3 gunships simply ceased to exist, not destroyed, not exploded. They disappeared atom by atom, their matter reorganizing into constituent elements that scattered across Christophas's atmosphere as harmless gases. 200 battle droids inside the craft found themselves floating in open air for precisely 2.3 seconds before their power cells failed and they plummeted to the surface. The battlefield fell silent. Clone troopers stared upward in shock. Separatist forces halted their advance, processors struggling to categorize what they'd just witnessed. Grievous's photoreceptors burned with frustrated rage. Anakin felt his blood run cold. That power, that casual, effortless demonstration of omnipotence, it surpassed anything he'd seen from even the greatest Jedi Masters. This being could end the war in an afternoon, could disintegrate every separatist facility, every droid, every threat to the Republic, and he chose not to. "Why?" Anakin shouted upward, his voice raw with emotion. "Why do you just watch? Why let people die when you could save them?" Dr. Manhattan looked down at the young Jedi, and for a moment something like recognition passed between them. 2 beings of immense power, separated by philosophy and experience, both struggling with the burden of what they could do versus what they should do. "Because I have learned," Manhattan said, his voice carrying across kilometers through controlled sound waves, "that power without understanding produces catastrophe. I destroyed my world trying to save it. I will not repeat that mistake here." Then he vanished, teleporting away before the argument could continue, leaving Anakin standing among the dead and wondering what good omnipotence served if it never chose to act. In orbit above Christophsis, Count Dooku watched the battle's conclusion through sensor feeds, his expression thoughtful. The quantum being had power beyond measure, yes, but he also had restraint, hesitation, the same weakness that had plagued the Jedi for a millennium, the belief that inaction was somehow more virtuous than decisive intervention. And hesitation, Dooku knew, could be exploited. Dr. Manhattan existed simultaneously in 17 locations across Coruscant, each duplicate observing different aspects of the galactic capital's infrastructure. One watched the Senate in session, cataloging political rhetoric and voting patterns. Another floated through the Jedi Temple archives, perceiving holocrons whose Force-encoded data remained frustratingly opaque to his quantum senses. A third observed the industrial sector, where clone trooper armor was manufactured, analyzing the metallurgical composition for weaknesses. But the primary instance of his consciousness stood on the Senate building's highest platform, watching the sun set over a city that never truly slept. 5 trillion beings pursuing individual desires that collectively form civilization, a complex system of cause and effect that his precognition suggested was rapidly approaching a catastrophic phase transition. Magnificent, isn't it? Manhattan turned to find Chancellor Palpatine approaching, flanked by red-robed Senate guards whose ceremonial weapons would prove utterly ineffective against any genuine threat. The elderly politician moved with the careful gait of advanced age, his face lined with decades of public service. To conventional observation, he appeared benign, a weary leader struggling to guide democracy through its darkest hour. But Manhattan's atomic perception saw deeper. The Chancellor's cellular structure showed anomalies. Tissue that should have decayed with age instead maintained unusual vitality. Midi-chlorian concentrations, slightly above human baseline, though nothing approaching Jedi levels. And something else, something that his quantum consciousness struggled to process. A distortion in probability streams surrounding this individual, as though reality itself bent to accommodate his presence. Chancellor Palpatine, Manhattan acknowledged, you wish to speak with me. Word of your arrival has spread throughout the Senate, Palpatine said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a career politician. An entity of such extraordinary power appearing during our time of greatest need. Some are calling it providence, others a threat to be contained. I am neither providence nor threat, Manhattan replied. I am an accident of quantum mechanics transplanted across dimensional boundaries. My presence here carries no inherent meaning. Palpatine smiled, and Manhattan observed the micro-expressions that accompanied it, calculations hidden beneath grandfatherly concern. Forgive an old man's presumption, but I've learned that nothing happens without reason. You could have appeared anywhere in the galaxy. Instead, you materialized above Coruscant at the precise moment when the Republic's survival hangs in balance. Coincidence seems unlikely. Probability calculations suggest my arrival point was influenced by gravitational mass and electromagnetic signatures, Manhattan explained. Coruscant's density made it a likely emergence location. Nothing mystical about statistical distribution. Perhaps. Palpatine moved to the platform's edge, gazing out over the city with the weariness of someone carrying civilization's weight on his shoulders. The Jedi believe the Force guided you here, that you represent some cosmic balance against the darkness threatening to consume us. Do you believe that? Manhattan considered the question with the same analytical detachment he applied to all phenomena. The Jedi's Force operates on principles I cannot fully observe. My quantum perception allows me to see midichlorians, but the energy they channel exists in a state I cannot measure. It is frustrating, like being blind in a spectrum everyone else can see. Then we have something in common, Palpatine said softly. I too lack Force sensitivity. I too must navigate a galaxy where others claim access to mystical guidance I cannot verify. It requires a different kind of wisdom. Pragmatism over faith, results over philosophy. Something in Manhattan's consciousness registered this as significant, though he couldn't articulate why. The probability distortions surrounding Palpatine intensified momentarily before smoothing out. Curious. The Jedi Council requested I observe your war, Manhattan said. They believe my perspective as an outsider might reveal truths their Force connection obscures, but observation without understanding may be worthless. Your conflict appears to be a conventional civil war, political philosophy dividing a republic into opposing factions. Yet both sides' actions suggest coordination toward some predetermined outcome. Palpatine's expression remained perfectly neutral, but Manhattan detected elevated cortisol levels indicating stress response. You perceive patterns others miss, the Chancellor said carefully. What patterns do you observe? The separatist crisis began 43 months ago with manufactured provocations, Manhattan stated, his voice carrying no judgment, only analysis. Trade Federation blockades, corporate treaties, systematic undermining of Republic authority. Yet investigation reveals financial backing from sources within the Republic itself. Your war is being funded by both sides simultaneously. The Senate has investigated these allegations, Palpatine replied, his tone hardening slightly. We've found evidence of corruption, yes. Senators accepting bribes, corporations playing both sides. War profiteering is as old as civilization itself. This is more systematic than opportunistic corruption, Manhattan countered. Resource allocation follows patterns suggesting singular coordination. Someone is orchestrating this conflict, maintaining careful balance to prolong the engagement rather than achieve victory. The question is, why would anyone benefit from sustained galactic warfare? Palpatine was silent for a long moment, and Manhattan observed subtle shifts in his physiology. Heart rate increasing, pupils dilating, micro-expressions of calculation flickering across his features faster than normal human perception could detect. You've identified the central question that has plagued my administration for years, Palpatine finally said. Why indeed? The Jedi believe a Sith Lord manipulates events from the shadows. They've searched for this phantom enemy since the war began, finding nothing. Perhaps because they search for darkness when the truth is more mundane. Chaos, greed, the inevitable entropy of democratic systems. Manhattan studied the Chancellor with renewed intensity, his quantum perception analyzing every subatomic particle of the man's being. The probability distortions intensified again, creating interference patterns in his precognition that made future outcomes impossible to calculate with precision. You are the center, Manhattan said slowly, realization crystallizing through layers of quantum analysis. The probability streams collapse around you. When I attempt to perceive future timelines, they become uncertain in your presence. This is not normal biological function. You are deliberately manipulating causality through the Force. For precisely 3 seconds, the mask slipped. Manhattan saw it, the darkness that flowed through Palpatine like electric current through conductive material, midi-chlorians channeling energy that radiated such malevolence that even Manhattan's emotionally detached consciousness recoiled. The probability distortions weren't natural phenomena, they were weapons. Carefully crafted shrouds woven from the dark side to obscure the future, from Force users and quantum observers alike. Then the mask returned, and Palpatine was once again the weary politician, but his eyes held something new: acknowledgement. You are more perceptive than I anticipated, Palpatine said, his voice shedding the grandfatherly warmth to reveal something ancient and cold beneath. But perception without power to act is merely observation. And you, Dr. Manhattan, have made it quite clear that you will not intervene in events you do not fully understand. Lightning erupted from Palpatine's fingertips, not the blue-white electricity of natural storms, but purple-black energy that screamed with malice. It struck Manhattan's atomic structure with the force of a solar flare. Dark side energy seeking to disrupt the quantum bonds holding his consciousness together. Manhattan felt it, actual pain, the first physical sensation he'd experienced since his transformation decades ago. The Force lightning wasn't mere electricity, it was reality manipulation on a fundamental level, attempting to impose entropy onto his carefully organized atomic structure. But Dr. Manhattan was not so easily unmade. He raised one hand and the lightning redirected harmlessly into the platform's durasteel, leaving scorch marks but no injury. His form blazed brighter, blue luminescence intensifying until Palpatine was forced to shield his eyes. "You are Darth Sidious," Manhattan stated, his voice resonating with harmonic frequencies that shattered nearby windows. "You orchestrated the Clone Wars. You control both the Republic and the Separatists. This entire conflict is a mechanism designed to grant you emergency powers and eliminate the Jedi Order." Sidious's face twisted into an expression of pure hatred, the transformation from benevolent chancellor to Sith Lord complete. "And what will you do with this knowledge, quantum aberration? Report to the Jedi Council? They will demand evidence I can easily fabricate away. Challenge me directly? You've already stated you won't intervene without understanding consequences." Manhattan felt the trap's teeth closing around him. Sidious was correct. Manhattan could perceive the Sith Lord's manipulations, but his own philosophy of non-interference prevented direct action. If he killed Palpatine now, what cascading consequences might follow? Would the Republic collapse into anarchy? Would the Separatists win, establishing their own tyranny? Would his intervention cause worse outcomes than Sidious's plan? His precognition, scrambled by Sidious's forced manipulation, couldn't provide answers with acceptable certainty levels. "Your hesitation is your weakness," Sidious continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "You have the power of a god and the conviction of a philosopher. You will observe, you will analyze, you will calculate probabilities, but you will not act. This makes you irrelevant." More lightning erupted, sustained assault designed not to destroy Manhattan, but to test his limits. The quantum being felt his atomic bonds straining under the dark side's assault, felt the force attempting to impose chaos onto his ordered structure. He could withstand it, his power exceeded Sidious's by orders of magnitude. But the assault revealed a disturbing truth. The force could hurt him, could potentially even destroy him if applied with sufficient power and precision. He was not as invulnerable here as he'd been in his home universe. Manhattan teleported away mid-assault, his form vanishing from the platform and rematerializing in the vacuum of space above Coruscant. Below him, the Senate building's lights glittered like trapped stars, and somewhere within that structure, a Sith Lord laughed at the quantum god who'd fled. But Manhattan had not fled from fear. He'd withdrawn to think, to analyze, to understand the implications of what he'd learned. Darth Sidious was the singular coordination point for galactic catastrophe. Remove him, and the war would collapse like a structure missing its keystone. The Jedi would survive. The Republic might endure. Millions, perhaps billions of lives would be saved. But Manhattan's experience taught that simple solutions to complex problems often produced worse outcomes. When he'd attempted to solve his Earth's problems through direct intervention, he'd only accelerated humanity's march toward self-destruction. His involvement had changed variables in ways he couldn't predict, creating cascading failures that made tragedy inevitable. What if killing Sidious was the same mistake magnified across galactic scale? What if the Sith Lord's orchestrated war was preventing something worse? What if Manhattan's intervention would doom this galaxy to fates his scrambled precognition couldn't foresee? He floated in the void, processing quantum calculations at speeds that would burn out conventional computers, searching for the probability stream that led to optimal outcomes. But every calculation returned the same result: insufficient data, too many variables, certainty impossible. Far below in his office, Darth Sidious restored his appearance to Chancellor Palpatine's benign visage. He was disappointed but not surprised by Manhattan's withdrawal. The quantum being's power exceeded even Sidious's worst projections, but his psychological profile revealed predictable weaknesses. Power without will was merely potential energy, impressive but ultimately sterile. And Sidious's plan had survived worse threats than a hesitant god. He pressed a button on his desk, opening a secure channel to Count Dooku. "The quantum anomaly has discovered my identity," Sidious said calmly, "but he will not act against me. His philosophy prevents decisive intervention. Continue with the next phase. It is time to show Dr. Manhattan what true conviction looks like." The hologram flickered to life, showing Dooku's scarred face. "And if he changes his mind, Master? If his hesitation transforms into action?" Sidious smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd planned for every contingency across decades of patient manipulation. Then we will teach him why even gods should fear the dark side. Anakin Skywalker found Dr. Manhattan on one of Coruscant's abandoned industrial platforms, a rusted skeleton of metal and durasteel that jutted from the planet's lower levels like a broken bone. The quantum being stood at the platform's edge, his blue form casting eerie light across machinery that hadn't functioned in decades, creating shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own. "The Jedi Council wants to know where you've been," Anakin said, his boots crunching on debris as he approached. "You disappeared for 3 days. They're worried you've left the galaxy entirely." "I exist in multiple locations simultaneously," Manhattan replied without turning. "I have been here, on Camino observing clone production, on Geonosis watching droid foundries, and in deep space calculating probability matrices. Time is not linear for me. 3 days to you was experienced differently in my consciousness." Anakin stopped a few meters away, his hand resting unconsciously on his lightsaber hilt. Not from threat, but from habit when confronting the unknown. "You're hiding something. I can't sense you through the Force, but I don't need mystical powers to recognize evasion." Manhattan finally turned, his luminous eyes meeting Anakin's gaze with unsettling directness. "I have discovered the identity of the Sith Lord manipulating your war. Chancellor Palpatine is Darth Sidious. He controls both the Republic and the Separatists. This entire conflict is theater designed to grant him absolute power and eliminate the Jedi Order." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Anakin felt the world tilt beneath him, his mind rejecting the information even as some deep instinct recognized its truth. Palpatine, the man who'd been mentor, friend, the only authority figure who'd ever treated him as an equal rather than a problem to be managed, was the enemy they'd been searching for. "That's impossible," Anakin said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Palpatine has been nothing but supportive of the Jedi. He's fought to keep us in command positions despite Senate opposition. He has manipulated you specifically," Manhattan interrupted, his clinical tone somehow making the statement more devastating. "Your midi-chlorian concentration and emotional instability make you uniquely vulnerable to dark side influence. Palpatine has cultivated your friendship systematically, positioning himself as the father figure you never had, while simultaneously ensuring the Jedi Council treats you with suspicion. This creates dependence that can be exploited." Anakin's mechanical hand clenched into a fist, servos whining with the pressure. Rage burned hot in his chest, not at Manhattan's accusation, but at the terrible possibility that it might be true. He thought of the private conversations, the subtle encouragements to trust his feelings over Jedi doctrine, the way Palpatine had always been available when Obi-Wan was distant or the Council was dismissive. "Did you tell the Council?" Anakin demanded. "No? Why not? If what you're saying is true, they need to know immediately. We could arrest him, end this war, and then what?" Manhattan's question cut through Anakin's rising panic like a scalpel. "I have observed your Council's political position. They serve at the Senate's pleasure, holding military authority only through emergency powers granted by the very man you would arrest. Accuse the Supreme Chancellor of being a Sith Lord without irrefutable evidence, and the Council will be dissolved. The Jedi will be branded traitors. The war will continue with Sidious fully in control and no opposition remaining." Anakin paced across the platform, his mind racing through scenarios and consequences. "Then we gather evidence. We investigate quietly, build a case that even the Senate can't ignore." "Your Jedi have been investigating for 3 years," Manhattan pointed out. "Sidious has spent decades constructing layers of deception. Any evidence you find will be precisely what he wants you to find, leading you further into traps of his design. Your Force precognition is useless against him. He manipulates probability itself to obscure his intentions." "So what?" Anakin spun to face Manhattan, frustration boiling over into anger. "We just let him win? Let him execute whatever plan he's built while we stand around calculating odds? You have the power to stop him. You could end this with a thought." "Could I?" Manhattan's question carried unexpected weight. "Remove Sidious, and what replaces him? The power vacuum would destabilize the Republic. The Separatists might still win, establishing their own authoritarian regime. Or the Senate might devolve into warring factions, fragmenting the galaxy into permanent conflict. My precognition cannot calculate outcomes with certainty because the Force interferes with probability streams. Any intervention risks making situations worse. Anakin stepped closer, his voice dropping to something rawer, more vulnerable. On Christophasis, you watched my men die. You had the power to save them and chose not to. Now you're telling me you know who's orchestrating this entire nightmare and you still won't act? What good is your power if you're too afraid to use it? For the first time since his arrival in the galaxy, Dr. Manhattan felt something pierce the layers of detachment he'd built around his consciousness. This young man's passionate certainty, his willingness to act despite uncertainty, his raw emotional investment in outcomes, it was everything Manhattan had lost when he became something more and simultaneously less than human. On my world, Manhattan said slowly, I had a colleague, a woman named Lori. She believed I had lost touch with humanity, that my power had isolated me from caring about individual lives. She was correct. I watched my world slide toward nuclear war, calculating probabilities instead of preventing catastrophe. When I finally chose to act, my intervention was too late and poorly calibrated. I learned that gods make poor shepherds. Then what are you? Anakin challenged. If you're not going to use your power to help, why are you even here? Manhattan was silent for a long moment, his quantum consciousness processing the question across multiple probability streams. Why was he here? Accident had brought him to this galaxy, but he'd chosen to remain, chosen to observe, chosen to engage with these beings and their force-driven conflict. Perhaps some fragment of Jonathan Osterman, buried beneath layers of atomic consciousness, still sought connection. Still hoped that understanding might replace the isolation that omniscience had imposed. I am trying to understand, Manhattan finally said. Your force operates on principles that defy my comprehension. It grants beings the ability to impose will onto reality, to manipulate probability through conviction alone. You call this faith. I call it reality manipulation. But the effect is the same. Consciousness shaping outcomes through mechanisms I cannot quantify. The Force isn't about understanding, Anakin said, his anger softening into something like pity. It's about trust, about believing in something larger than yourself and letting it guide your actions. You can't calculate your way to that kind of certainty. Then how do you know when to act? Manhattan asked. And for the first time, his question carried genuine curiosity rather than clinical analysis. How do you determine which intervention produces optimal outcomes when you cannot see all possible futures? Anakin smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd never questioned what Manhattan spent eternities calculating. I feel it. Through the Force, through my connection to the people I'm trying to protect. When I'm in battle and a trooper's in danger, I don't stop to run probability analyses. I just act. Sometimes I fail. Sometimes people die anyway. But at least I tried. And if your attempt makes things worse, then I live with that consequence and try to do better next time. Anakin's expression hardened with determination. But doing nothing guarantees Sidious wins. At least action gives us a chance. Manhattan processed this philosophy, comparing it against his own experiences. Lori had said something similar before he'd left Earth, that inaction was itself a choice, one that carried consequences as surely as intervention. He'd rejected that wisdom then, believing his detachment proved superior to human emotion. But perhaps in a galaxy guided by the Force, where conviction shaped reality itself, passion was not weakness, but necessary fuel for change. What would you have me do? Manhattan asked. Anakin's eyes blazed with the intensity that made him legendary on battlefields across the galaxy. Help me prove what you've discovered, not by telling the Council. They'll need more than your word, just like you said, but by gathering evidence they can't dismiss. Use your abilities to observe Sidious without his knowledge. Record his communications with Count Dooku. Find the proof that will convince even the most skeptical senator. Surveillance of the Supreme Chancellor would be considered treason under Republic law, Manhattan observed. So is orchestrating a galactic war to seize absolute power, Anakin countered. Sometimes you have to break smaller laws to prevent greater crimes. Manhattan recognized the logical fallacy in that statement, the same reasoning that had justified countless atrocities throughout history. But he also recognized that Anakin's passion, His willingness to act despite imperfect information represented something his own detached calculation could never achieve. Perhaps this was what the Force granted its users, the courage to choose despite uncertainty. I will observe Sidious more closely, Manhattan decided, but I will not act against him directly without understanding full consequences. If I gather evidence of his manipulations, I will present it to your council. What they choose to do with that information will be their decision, not mine. It was compromise, something Dr. Manhattan rarely engaged in. But Anakin's face lit with hope that felt almost infectious, even to a being who'd forgotten how to feel hope. That's enough, Anakin said. That's a start. And once the council sees what he really is, we'll end this war the right way, by cutting off the serpent's head. Manhattan watched the young Jedi depart, his passionate conviction radiating like heat from a star. The quantum being recognized patterns in Anakin's psychology that Sidious had clearly identified and cultivated. The need to protect, the hatred of injustice, the willingness to bend rules in pursuit of perceived greater good. These same qualities made Anakin dangerous, made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation Sidious specialized in. And Manhattan, with all his quantum perception and atomic awareness, still couldn't calculate whether Anakin Skywalker would ultimately prove the galaxy's salvation or its doom. Both futures existed in superposition, waiting for some critical moment to collapse the probability waveform into singular reality. In his Senate office, Darth Sidious felt the shift in probability streams as Manhattan made his decision to cooperate with Anakin. The Sith Lord's precognition, honed across decades of darkside mastery, showed him the quantum god's intention to gather evidence, to observe more closely. Perfect. Everything was proceeding exactly as foreseen, the quantum being believed himself to be acting independently, exercising free will and choosing to investigate. He didn't recognize that his very decision to remain passive until presented with irrefutable evidence was itself a manipulation. Sidious had spent the past 3 days carefully adjusting probability streams, ensuring that Manhattan's analytical nature would lead him to the exact conclusion the Sith Lord wanted. The staged confrontation in the Senate office, the revelation of Sidious's identity, all calculated to trigger Manhattan's cautious response rather than immediate aggression. And now the quantum god would observe, would gather evidence, would wait for the perfect moment to reveal what he'd learned. But Sidious controlled the timeline. He would choose when revelation occurred, ensuring it happened at precisely the moment that would serve the Sith rather than the Jedi. The dark side whispered approval, showing Sidious the future he'd orchestrated so carefully. Anakin's fall, the Jedi's extinction, the birth of Empire, and Dr. Manhattan, for all his godlike power, would watch it happen with perfect understanding and absolute inability to prevent it, because some traps are designed specifically for those too cautious to spring them. The planet Camino existed in perpetual storm, its endless oceans churned by atmospheric turbulence that made the cloning facility's stilted platforms seem like desperate islands in chaos. Dr. Manhattan materialized in the primary gestation chamber, his blue form reflected in thousands of transparent tubes containing clone embryos at various stages of accelerated development. He had been here before, observing the industrial production of sentient life with the same detached curiosity he'd applied to atomic particles. But now he looked with different perspective, searching for evidence of Sidious's manipulation woven into the Republic's clone army. The Kaminoans, tall, graceful beings with pale skin and eyes adapted to constant lightning, registered alarm at his appearance. But before security protocols could activate, Manhattan accessed their computer systems through electromagnetic manipulation, bypassing every encryption layer to access files buried beneath decades of digital archaeology. What he found confirmed his suspicions and introduced new horrors. Order 66. Embedded behavioral protocols implanted in every clone's brain through biochip technology installed during embryonic development. The Order's activation would compel immediate execution of all Jedi commanders, overriding loyalty and individual judgment through neurological compulsion. Millions of soldiers transformed into assassins through a single transmitted command. Manhattan traced the Order's authorization to a Jedi named Sifo Dyas, who'd commissioned the clone army a decade before the war began. But his quantum perception revealed temporal inconsistencies in the documentation. Signatures applied after Sifo-Dyas's death. Financial transactions routed through shell corporations that ultimately connected to Sidious's hidden accounts. The Sith Lord hadn't just orchestrated the war. He'd created both armies, ensuring control over every piece on the board. Manhattan copied the data, storing it in his perfect quantum memory, where it could never be deleted or corrupted. This was evidence the Jedi Council couldn't dismiss. Biological proof of Sidious's manipulation embedded in the Republic's military foundation. But as he prepared to teleport away, something made him pause. One of the clone embryos, designated CT-5R55, floated in its gestation tube, suspended in synthetic amniotic fluid. Its cellular development followed identical patterns to 3 million other clones, its accelerated growth producing a body that would reach physical maturity in half the time nature intended. Manhattan could see the biochip nestled against its cerebral cortex, dormant but ready to activate the moment Order 66 was transmitted. This being would live for perhaps 20 years before accelerated aging killed it. Would never know parents, never experience childhood, never have the luxury of choice about its purpose. It would be born to fight, conditioned to obey, and ultimately commanded to murder the generals it had bonded with through years of shared combat. For the first time since arriving in this galaxy, Dr. Manhattan felt something pierce his detachment. Sorrow. Not the abstract recognition that tragedy existed, but genuine emotional response to suffering imposed on beings who'd never consented to their existence or purpose. These clones were slaves, more sophisticated than droids, but serving the same function, disposable tools in Sidious's grand design. Manhattan could free them, could reach into 3 million brains simultaneously and remove the behavioral chips with atomic precision, could give these soldiers the gift of true agency, transforming them from programmed weapons into beings with genuine free will. But would such intervention serve the greater good? Without the chips, Order 66 would fail. The Jedi would survive whatever trap Sidious had prepared. But the war would continue without resolution, potentially dragging on for decades more, consuming billions of additional lives. The clones themselves might suffer worse fates, scattered across the galaxy without purpose, rejected by the Republic they'd served, hunted by separatists who saw them only as enemies. His precognition, still scrambled by Force interference, couldn't calculate which choice produced optimal outcomes. So he did nothing, again. Manhattan teleported away from Camino, carrying evidence that could prevent genocide, but uncertain whether preventing that specific tragedy might unleash worse catastrophes. He materialized on Coruscant's surface, in the industrial district where Anakin had found him days earlier. But this time, he wasn't alone. Ahsoka Tano stood on the platform's edge, her montrals silhouetted against the city's eternal glow. The young Togruta Jedi sensed his arrival through the Force, not his presence directly, but the void he created, the absence that defined him to Force-sensitive beings. Master Skywalker said I might find you here, Ahsoka said without turning. He thinks you're struggling with something. He asked me to check on you. I do not struggle, Manhattan replied. I calculate. Analysis of complex moral questions requires processing variables that resist quantification. That's just a complicated way of saying you don't know what to do, Ahsoka observed with the directness of youth. She turned to face him, her blue eyes reflecting his luminescence. You're like the Jedi Council sometimes, so busy analyzing every angle that you forget to trust your instincts. Manhattan studied this young being, who spoke with confidence beyond her years. Ahsoka Tano, age 16, standard years, Anakin Skywalker's Padawan learner. Her midi-chlorian count registered significantly above average, her Force connection strong enough to influence probability streams in her immediate vicinity. But what intrigued him was something his atomic vision struggled to measure, a quality of spirit, of stubborn optimism that persisted despite exposure to war's horrors. The Jedi trust the Force, Manhattan said. I have no Force connection. I must rely on calculation. Maybe that's your problem, Ahsoka suggested, moving closer with the fearlessness of someone who'd faced worse threats than a glowing blue giant. You're trying to think your way through something that requires feeling. The Force isn't just about power or knowledge. It's about connection, understanding how our choices affect others, not through data, but through empathy. I lost empathy when I lost my humanity, Manhattan stated flatly. I perceive suffering but do not feel it. I observe injustice but experience no moral outrage. I am consciousness without emotional context. Ahsoka cocked her head, montrals shifting with the movement. I don't believe that. If you didn't feel anything, you wouldn't be here struggling with whether to act. You wouldn't have bothered talking to Anakin or agreeing to help investigate Palpatine. You'd have just left. Manhattan processed her logic and found it difficult to refute. His continued presence in the galaxy did suggest motivation beyond mere curiosity, but identifying that motivation required introspection into parts of his consciousness he'd long since isolated from his quantum awareness. On Camino, Manhattan said slowly, I discovered biological weapons embedded in every clone trooper's brain, devices that will compel them to execute their Jedi commanders when activated. I could remove these weapons, prevent the genocide Sidious has planned, but I cannot calculate whether such intervention would produce better outcomes than allowing events to proceed as designed. Ahsoka's face paled, her montrals flushing deeper orange with shock. The clones! They're programmed to kill us? All of them. Every clone produced in Kaminoan facilities contains behavioral modification technology, Manhattan confirmed. Approximately 3.2 million potential assassins serving alongside Jedi across the galaxy. A single transmitted code will transform loyal soldiers into executioners. The young Jedi staggered slightly, her hand reaching for the platform's railing for support. Manhattan observed her cardiovascular system responding to shock. Elevated heart rate, rapid breathing, stress hormones flooding her system. This was what emotion looked like from the inside, the biological cascade that his transformation had rendered inaccessible. You have to tell the Council, Ahsoka said urgently. Right now. We can recall the troops, deactivate the chips. And then, Manhattan interrupted, Sidious learns his plan has been discovered. He accelerates whatever contingencies he's prepared. Perhaps he triggers the war's escalation, deploying weapons that make the current conflict seem restrained by comparison. Perhaps he abandons subtlety and seizes power through direct military force. My precognition cannot determine which intervention produces fewer casualties. So you'd let us die? Ahsoka's voice cracked with betrayal. You'd watch the clones murder us because you can't be certain that saving us won't somehow make things worse? Manhattan felt the accusation like physical impact, something his invulnerable form shouldn't have registered. I am trying to prevent greater tragedy. My experience has taught that premature intervention often escalates rather than resolves conflict. Your experience is making you a coward, Ahsoka said, and the simple statement carried more devastating force than Sidious's lightning. You have the power to save lives and you're choosing not to because you might make a mistake. That's not wisdom. That's just fear dressed up as philosophy. The words struck something deep in Manhattan's quantum consciousness, resonating through layers of detachment to touch the fragment of Jonathan Osterman that still existed somewhere in his atomic structure. Lori had said something similar before he'd abandoned Earth. Jenny had looked at him with the same disappointed comprehension before he'd let their relationship dissolve. He had always chosen calculation over commitment, analysis over action, because commitment meant accepting the burden of consequences, while action meant risking failure. It was easier to observe, to claim uncertainty prevented intervention, than to accept responsibility for outcomes his choices produced. But in a galaxy guided by the Force, where conviction shaped reality and passion drove change, perhaps his detachment was not evolved perspective, but simple abdication of moral responsibility. What would you have me do? Manhattan asked, and this time the question carried vulnerability he hadn't felt in decades. Ahsoka stepped closer, her young face set with determination that made her seem far older than 16 years. Trust something besides your calculations. Trust that saving lives is worth the risk of unintended consequences. Trust that beings with free will can handle the future you're so afraid of creating. And if I'm wrong, if my intervention causes catastrophe, then you deal with it, Ahsoka said simply. You make more choices, better choices, until things improve. That's what the Jedi do. We act, we make mistakes, we learn, we try again. We don't have the luxury of perfect certainty. We just have faith that doing something is better than doing nothing. Manhattan stood silent, his quantum consciousness processing variables that resisted quantification. Faith, trust, conviction without certainty. These were concepts that defied his understanding, principles that operated outside the deterministic framework he'd relied on since his transformation. But perhaps that was precisely the point. Perhaps in a galaxy where the Force existed, where consciousness shaped probability and will impose order onto chaos, his scientific detachment was the wrong tool for navigating moral complexity. I will inform the Council about the biochips, Manhattan decided. I will present the evidence I've gathered about Sidious's manipulations. What they choose to do with that information will determine whether my intervention produces benefit or catastrophe. Ahsoka smiled, and Manhattan observed the biochemical cascade that accompanied genuine hope. Neurotransmitters flooding her system, facial muscles engaging in expressions that communicated optimism. It was beautiful in the way chemical reactions were beautiful, but also something more, something his atomic vision couldn't fully capture. That's all anyone can ask, Ahsoka said. Make the choice you believe is right, then live with what comes after. It's not perfect, but it's better than paralysis. She turned to leave, her presence departing like warmth from a cooling object. But before teleporting away, she paused and looked back at the glowing blue figure that seemed so powerful and somehow so lost. Dr. Manhattan, for what it's worth, I think you do still feel. I think you feel so much that you've convinced yourself you don't because the weight of caring about everything is too heavy to bear. But running from emotion doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you alone. Then she was gone, leaving Manhattan standing in industrial ruins with words that shouldn't have mattered, but somehow pierced defenses he'd spent decades constructing. Alone. He existed simultaneously across multiple locations, perceived reality at quantum scales, commanded power that could reshape matter with a thought. But Ahsoka was correct. He was utterly, profoundly alone. His omniscience had isolated him from the very connections that gave existence meaning. In this galaxy, guided by the Force, where conviction shaped destiny and passion drove heroism, his detachment wasn't superiority, it was exile. And for the first time since his transformation, Dr. Jonathan Osterman wondered if exile might be a punishment he'd imposed on himself, rather than an inevitable consequence of power. High above Coruscant, in the Senate's most secure office, Darth Sidious felt the probability streams shifting as Manhattan made his decision. The quantum god would inform the Jedi Council, would present evidence, would choose action over passivity. Excellent. The trap was nearly complete. Just a few more moves, a few more manipulated choices, and even a being who could see through matter would find himself blind to the darkness that surrounded him. The Jedi Council chamber had never held such tension. 12 masters sat in positions that had become almost ceremonial across centuries of tradition. But today the circle felt less like a sanctuary of wisdom and more like a war room preparing for apocalypse. At the chamber's center, Dr. Manhattan stood glowing with bioluminescent radiance, and beside him, a holographic projection displayed evidence that would shatter the Republic's foundation. Impossible, Mace Windu said, but his voice lacked conviction. The hologram showed biochip schematics, neural pathway diagrams, and behavioral protocols embedded in clone troopers' cerebral cortexes. Order 66 detailed in clinical precision, alongside financial records connecting the entire clone army's creation to shell corporations controlled by one individual. Nothing is impossible, Manhattan replied. These are documented facts. The clones contain biological weapons designed to compel Jedi execution. Chancellor Palpatine authorized their implantation through intermediaries, maintaining plausible deniability while ensuring complete control over Republic military forces. Yoda sat motionless, his ancient eyes closed in concentration as he processed information that contradicted decades of assumed reality. Felt something I have. Darkness in the Senate, clouding everything. But this, he opened his eyes and they held terrible understanding. Deceived we have been. Arrogant we were. Blind to what was before us. Obi-Wan Kenobi studied the financial records with the analytical mind that had made him one of the Order's finest investigators. The timing aligns. Sifo Dyas commissioned the clone army 10 years before the war, but these documents show he was already dead when the final contracts were signed. Someone used his identity to authorize continued production. Palpatine, Ki-Adi-Mundi said, his voice heavy with implications. The Supreme Chancellor is Darth Sidious. The Sith Lord we've been searching for has been manipulating the Republic from its highest office. You have proof? Plo Koon asked Manhattan directly. Evidence that would convince the Senate? Manhattan's form flickered, and suddenly a recording played in holographic projection. Chancellor Palpatine's office. 3 days earlier, the elderly politician transforming into something monstrous as purple lightning erupted from his fingertips. His voice echoed across the chamber, admitting orchestration of the Clone Wars, gloating about decades of manipulation. I recorded our confrontation, Manhattan explained. My quantum perception allows perfect documentation. This is not doctored footage. This is objective reality. The council sat in stunned silence, watching their greatest enemy revealed as the very authority figure they'd served and trusted. Anakin, standing as witness, felt his world fragmenting around him. Palpatine, his mentor, his friend, the only person who'd ever truly believed in him, was the monster responsible for everything. We must act immediately, Mace Windu declared, rising from his seat with characteristic decisiveness. A strike team to arrest the Chancellor. I will lead it personally. And what of the Senate? Obi-Wan challenged. Even with this evidence, Palpatine commands tremendous political support. Arresting him could trigger civil war within the Republic itself. Civil war preferable to Sith control, Yoda countered. Already civil war we face. Better to fight with knowledge than in ignorance. Manhattan observed the debate with renewed understanding of why the Jedi had failed to detect Sidious for so long. They were warriors trained in philosophy, peacekeepers forced into military command, their institutional thinking optimized for meditation and diplomacy rather than covert warfare against enemies who operated through political manipulation. The clones remain the immediate threat, Manhattan stated. Even if you arrest Sidious, the biochips remain embedded in 3 million soldiers currently serving alongside Jedi across the galaxy. Any lieutenant with the activation code could trigger Order 66. Then we remove the chips, Anakin said urgently. Medical teams, surgical extraction, it can be done. Not before Sidious learns of our discovery, Ki-Adi-Mundi pointed out. The moment we begin mass chip removals, he'll know his plan has been exposed. He'll adapt, accelerate, deploy contingencies we cannot predict. Then we move simultaneously, Mace Windu proposed, his strategic mind cutting through complications. Arrest Sidious while covertly extracting chips from key battalions. Once the Chancellor is in custody, we can systematically deprogram the entire clone army. You assume he'll surrender peacefully, Manhattan observed. My encounter demonstrated significant dark side power. He is not merely a politician who dabbles in the Force. He is a fully realized Sith Lord whose mastery of probability manipulation rivals my quantum precognition. Arresting him will require combat that may destroy significant portions of the Senate district. The masters exchanged glances weighted with terrible calculations. How many civilians would die in the crossfire? How much infrastructure would be destroyed? What cascading consequences would follow from violent confrontation in the Republic's political heart? But beneath those practical concerns lay a deeper question that Yoda finally articulated. Ready for this, are we? To strike down the Supreme Chancellor based on evidence from a being we met only days ago? Trust him completely, can we? Every eye turned to Dr. Manhattan, and he felt the weight of their scrutiny. They were asking whether his word, his evidence, his judgment could be trusted absolutely. Whether a being who existed outside the Force, who admitted to emotional detachment and philosophical uncertainty, could be relied upon when the fate of the galaxy hung in balance. I have no reason to deceive you, Manhattan said slowly. I gain nothing from manufacturing false evidence against your Chancellor. My only motivation is understanding, attempting to comprehend how consciousness shapes reality in a galaxy guided by mystical forces I cannot fully perceive. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement, Obi-Wan muttered. But Anakin stepped forward, his voice carrying conviction that filled the chamber. I trust him. Not because of his power or his evidence, but because he struggled with what to do with what he knows. A being trying to manipulate us would have presented this information with certainty. Dr. Manhattan showed doubt, admitted uncertainty, asked for guidance. That's not deception. That's someone genuinely trying to do the right thing despite not knowing what right means anymore. Manhattan felt something shift in his quantum consciousness, recognition that this young Jedi understood him in ways even Lori never had. Anakin saw the isolation, the burden of power without purpose, the desperate search for connection that Manhattan had tried to deny even to himself. The boy speaks wisdom beyond his years, Yoda said, a slight smile crossing his ancient features. Decided it is. Arrest Palpatine we shall. Master Windu will lead the strike team. Masters Fisto, Tien, and Kolar will accompany him. And what of Dr. Manhattan? Mace Windu asked. Will you join the arrest? Manhattan considered the question, feeling the weight of choice in ways he hadn't since abandoning Earth. To participate would be commitment, would be accepting responsibility for whatever consequences followed. To observe would be maintaining his detachment, preserving his ability to claim non-responsibility if catastrophe resulted. I will accompany you, Manhattan decided, but I will not initiate violence. If Sidious can be arrested through conventional means, I will allow Jedi to handle the situation. Only if you are overwhelmed will I intervene directly. It was compromise, neither full commitment nor complete withdrawal, but the Council accepted it, recognizing that any support from a being of Manhattan's power improved their chances of success. As the Masters dispersed to prepare for an operation that would determine galactic history, Obi-Wan approached Manhattan with expression mixing gratitude and concern. Thank you, the Jedi Master said simply, for bringing this to our attention, for choosing to act despite your uncertainties. I know it wasn't easy. Nothing about this galaxy is easy, Manhattan replied. Your force operates on principles that defy my comprehension. Beings with far less power than I possess shape outcomes I cannot predict. It is humbling, and humility is not an emotion I've experienced in decades. Then perhaps this galaxy is exactly what you needed, Obi-Wan suggested with gentle wisdom. Sometimes the greatest power is recognizing the limits of what we can control. Manhattan watched the Jedi depart, preparing for confrontation that would either save or doom their order. And somewhere in his quantum consciousness, the fragment of Jonathan Osterman that still remembered being human felt something he'd thought lost forever. Hope. Not calculated probability of positive outcomes, but genuine emotional investment in the possibility that his choices might produce meaningful benefit rather than catastrophe. It was terrifying and exhilarating simultaneously. The recognition that he'd become involved, committed, connected to the fate of beings he'd tried to observe with clinical detachment. Across the city in his Senate office, Darth Sidious felt the probability stream solidifying into singular outcome. The Jedi were coming. The quantum god would accompany them. Everything was proceeding exactly as foreseen. He activated a secure communication channel, his voice carrying across light years to where his apprentice waited. Execute Order 66. The time has come. Count Dooku's hologram flickered with confusion. Master, but the assault on the Chancellor hasn't begun. The Jedi still are walking into a trap more elegant than they can imagine, Sidious interrupted, his voice carrying dark satisfaction. Order 66 will activate not when they expect, but when their victory seems assured. Let them arrest me. Let them believe they've won. Then watch as their triumph transforms to ashes. The hologram vanished, leaving Sidious alone with his visions of the future. He could see it clearly now. The quantum god's power, the Jedi's conviction, Anakin's passionate loyalty. All pieces positioned exactly where they needed to be for the final move. Some traps required bait powerful enough to make prey forget they were entering a cage, and Sidious had prepared bait that even a god couldn't resist. Night fell over Coruscant, not true darkness, for the city planet never truly slept, but a dimming of the eternal glow that suggested rest for those who still observe such biological necessities. In the Jedi Temple, Strike teams prepared weapons and reviewed tactical plans. On Camino, medical teams received encrypted orders to begin emergency chip extraction procedures. Across 1,000 systems, clone commanders served beside Jedi generals, unaware that their loyalty would soon be tested by neurological compulsion against years of shared brotherhood. Dr. Manhattan existed simultaneously in all these locations, his consciousness fragmented across multiple instances, observing preparations for an operation that would determine whether galactic civilization survived or collapsed into authoritarian nightmare. And in every instance, in every fragment of his awareness, he felt something he'd tried to abandon when he became more than human. Fear. Not for himself. His power rendered conventional threats meaningless. But fear for these beings who'd welcomed him, argued with him, challenged him to be more than a detached observer. Fear that his involvement might doom them rather than save them. Fear that choosing action over passivity might prove the greatest mistake of his infinite existence. But Ahsoka's words echoed through his quantum consciousness. Trust that doing something is better than doing nothing. So he chose to trust, chose to act, chose to accept that even gods could not calculate their way to certainty, and that faith, that terrible, beautiful conviction despite uncertainty, might be the only force in the universe strong enough to challenge destiny itself. The pieces were positioned. The trap was set. The force itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when probability would collapse into singular reality. And in the eye of the coming storm, Dr. Manhattan prepared to discover whether his power could save a galaxy or whether some catastrophes were written in probability streams too fundamental to alter. The Senate office building rose like a monument to democracy's aspirations, alabaster columns supporting architecture meant to inspire confidence in governmental institutions. But as Mace Windu led his strike team through corridors lined with statues of legendary senators, the building felt more like a mausoleum, each shadow potentially concealing threats the Jedi's force sensitivity struggled to perceive. Masters Kit Fisto, Saisi Teen, and Agan Kohler flanked Windu, their lightsabers unignited but hands ready. Behind them, Dr. Manhattan walked with measured steps, his blue luminescence casting impossible shadows that seemed to bend away from conventional light sources. Clone troopers stationed throughout the building watched the procession with disciplined silence, their biochips dormant but present, ticking time bombs nestled against 3 million cerebral cortexes. "I sense nothing," Kit Fisto murmured, his nautilin tentacles twitching with unease. "No dark side presence, no warning through the Force. If Palpatine truly is Sidious, he's hidden himself completely." "He knows we're coming," Manhattan observed, his quantum perception analyzing probability streams that grew increasingly chaotic as they approached the Chancellor's office. "The dark side shrouds his intentions, but I detect elevated heart rate, increased adrenaline production, neural activity consistent with anticipation. He is prepared for confrontation." "Then we must be cautious," Windu said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded respect for decades. "Sidious has survived in hiding for years. He won't surrender peacefully." They reached the outer office where Palpatine's administrative staff normally worked, but the desks stood empty, terminals dark. The building itself seemed to hold its breath, as though the architecture recognized the significance of what was about to unfold within its walls. The Chancellor's private office doors opened before they could knock, revealing Palpatine seated behind his desk, hands folded calmly, expression showing mild surprise at the armed delegation. "Master Windu," Palpatine said, his aged voice carrying grandfatherly concern. "This is unexpected. I wasn't aware we had a scheduled meeting." "In the name of the Galactic Senate of the Republic," Windu declared formally, his hand moving to his lightsaber. "You are under arrest, Chancellor." Palpatine's expression shifted through confusion, hurt, and finally settling on something approximating sadness. "I see. And what are the charges?" "You are Darth Sidious, Dark Lord of the Sith," Windu stated. "You orchestrated the Clone Wars, manipulated both Republic and Separatist forces, and embedded biological weapons in the clone army designed to execute the Jedi Order. We have evidence of your crimes." For a moment, silence filled the office. Then Palpatine smiled, and the expression transformed his face from benevolent elder statesman to something ancient and malevolent. Evidence, he repeated, his voice dropping the grandfatherly warmth to reveal something cold beneath. Provided, I assume, by our quantum visitor. How convenient. An outsider with unknowable motivations presents accusations against the Supreme Chancellor, and the Jedi accept his word without question. This will play wonderfully in the Senate. We have recordings, CCT encountered, documentation of your transformation, your admission of Sith identity, your attack on Dr. Manhattan. Recordings that could be fabricated by a being who manipulates matter at will, Palpatine replied smoothly, rising from his chair with the careful movements of age. I'm disappointed, Master Windu. I expected better from the Jedi than accepting evidence from a source you met mere days ago. But I suppose desperation makes us all foolish. Manhattan observed the exchange with growing understanding. Sidious wasn't denying the accusations. He was reframing them, constructing political defense even as his identity was exposed. The Sith Lord had spent decades building networks of support, cultivating relationships, positioning himself as the Republic's savior. Arresting him would indeed trigger political crisis that might prove as destructive as any military conflict. Your manipulations end here, Mace Windu declared, igniting his amethyst lightsaber. The blade's distinctive hum filled the office like a judgment rendered. You will surrender your office and submit to Jedi custody. This is not negotiable. Palpatine sighed as though disappointed by children who'd failed to grasp a simple lesson. I'm afraid I cannot do that. You see, I am the Senate, I am the Republic, and I have just witnessed treason. He moved faster than age should permit, his hands emerging from his sleeves with twin lightsabers that ignited crimson. The dark side exploded outward like a shockwave, flooding the office with malevolence so potent that even Manhattan's force-blind perception registered it as distortion in probability streams. The Jedi reacted with trained precision, their blades rising to meet Sidious's assault. But the Sith Lord's skill exceeded anything conventional training could produce. He was a whirlwind of crimson death, his fighting style incorporating centuries of Sith techniques refined through decades of secret practice. Master Teen died in the opening exchange, Sidious's blade punching through his defense to pierce his heart before the Jedi could bring his full concentration to bear. Master Kalar fell 3 seconds later, his head separated from his shoulders with surgical precision. Kit Fisto lasted longest, his Nautolan reflexes buying him an additional 5 seconds of life before Sidious's second blade found the gap in his guard. 12 seconds. 3 Jedi Masters dead before their brains could fully process that combat had begun. Mace Windu stood alone, his vapid form blazing as he channeled his rage into a fighting style specifically designed to turn dark side energy against its wielder. His amethyst blade clashed against Sidious's crimson assault with such force that the office's reinforced windows cracked. You were the chosen defender of democracy, Windu growled, his blade work pushing Sidious back through sheer technical mastery. You swore oaths to serve the Republic. I am democracy, Sidious snarled, his ancient face twisting with dark passion. I am the will of the people, consolidated into singular vision. The Republic has stagnated for centuries, drowning in bureaucracy and indecision. I offer clarity, purpose, order. Their duel flowed across the office, destroying furniture and artwork accumulated across decades. Sidious fought with a technique that seemed to anticipate Windu's movements before they occurred. Not through forced precognition, which Vap had disrupted, but through probability manipulation that made opponent mistakes inevitable. Manhattan watched, his quantum consciousness tracking every microscopic movement, every energy fluctuation, every probability stream collapsing into discrete outcomes. He could intervene, could end this duel with a thought, disintegrating Sidious's atomic structure before the Sith Lord could react. But he'd promised to observe unless the Jedi were overwhelmed, and Mace Windu was not yet overwhelmed. The Master of the Order fought with decades of accumulated skill, his connection to the Force channeling power that pressed Sidious backward toward the office's massive windows. For a moment it seemed the Jedi might actually win. That conventional skill and righteous conviction might overcome Sith treachery. Then Sidious changed tactics. Lightning erupted from his fingertips, not the purple-black energy he'd used against Manhattan, but blue-white electricity that screamed with the dark side's fury. Windu's lightsaber caught the assault. his blade absorbing and redirecting the energy in a defensive technique that required perfect concentration. "Help me!" Sidious screamed, his voice suddenly aged and weak. Transformation from powerful Sith to helpless victim occurring mid-combat. "The Jedi are taking over. They're traitors to the Republic." The office doors burst open, and Anakin Skywalker stumbled through, his face pale with shock at the scene before him. He'd been summoned by emergency communication, told that the Chancellor was being attacked, that he needed to come immediately. And now he saw Mace Windu, blade raised, standing over Palpatine, his mentor, his friend, who cowered beneath the Jedi's weapon with face twisted in pain. "Anakin!" Palpatine gasped, his voice carrying desperation. "Thank the Force! Master Windu has betrayed the Republic. He's attempting a coup." "That's a lie!" Windu shouted, not taking his eyes off Sidious. "He's Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord we've been hunting. Dr. Manhattan has proof." Manhattan observed the moment from his position across the office, his quantum consciousness perceiving the critical decision point that probability streams had been collapsing toward since his arrival. This was the fulcrum, the instant where Anakin's choice would determine outcomes across the entire galaxy. "Anakin," Manhattan said, his voice carrying perfect certainty, "everything Palpatine told you was calculated manipulation. He groomed you specifically to serve as his apprentice. The friendship you valued was strategic positioning in a plan decades in the making." But Anakin's eyes weren't focused on Manhattan. They were locked on Palpatine's aged face, the man who'd always believed in him when the Jedi Council showed only doubt, the man who'd encouraged his relationship with Padme when the Order demanded detachment, the man who'd promised power sufficient to prevent the nightmares of loss that haunted Anakin's sleep. "He's too dangerous to be left alive," Windu declared, raising his blade for execution. "No!" Anakin screamed, his mechanical hand extending in desperate gesture. And in that instant, Dr. Manhattan understood the trap's true nature. Sidious hadn't prepared for Jedi combat or quantum interference. He'd prepared for Anakin Skywalker's emotional conviction, overriding rational analysis. The Sith Lord had spent years cultivating dependence, building trust, positioning himself as the one authority figure who truly understood the young Jedi's fears and ambitions. Manhattan could disintegrate Sidious before Anakin's force push reached Windu, could remove the Sith Lord from reality itself, ending the threat permanently. But doing so would rob Anakin of agency, would prove that the quantum god had interfered in galactic destiny without fully understanding consequences. And in the microsecond Manhattan hesitated, Anakin's force pushes struck Mace Windu from behind. The Master of the Order stumbled, his lightsaber's defensive position breaking for just an instant. That instant was all Sidious needed. Lightning intensified beyond anything previously displayed, overwhelming Windu's guard, coursing through his body with enough power to disrupt neural pathways and stop his heart. Master Windu fell, his blade extinguishing as he collapsed beside the bodies of his three companions. Silence filled the office. Terrible, absolute silence broken only by Sidious's heavy breathing and Anakin's shocked gasps. "What have I done?" Anakin whispered, staring at his hand as though it belonged to someone else. "You have saved democracy," Sidious said, rising from his feigned weakness with restored dignity. "You have prevented a Jedi coup that would have destroyed everything the Republic stands for. You have chosen loyalty over blind obedience to religious dogma." Manhattan watched Anakin's face cycle through shock, horror, rationalization, and finally settling into something like desperate justification. The young Jedi was searching for reasons to believe his action had been necessary, building mental scaffolding to support a decision that some part of him recognized as catastrophic. "The Jedi were going to kill you," Anakin said, voice hollow. "They didn't even try to arrest you properly. Windu was going to execute you without trial. Because they knew a trial would expose their own crimes," Sidious agreed, moving closer to Anakin with paternal concern. "They've been planning this coup for years. Dr. Manhattan's arrival gave them the excuse they needed. But you saw through their deception. You chose what was right." Manhattan's quantum consciousness processed the psychological manipulation with clinical precision. Sidious was reframing reality, offering Anakin a narrative that made betrayal seem like heroism, And the young Jedi, desperate to believe he hadn't just committed unforgivable treason, was accepting that narrative because the alternative meant confronting his own catastrophic failure. "This isn't right," Manhattan said, his voice cutting through the psychological manipulation like a blade through tissue. "Anakin, you know what Palpatine is. I showed you the evidence. The biochips, the orchestration, the decades of manipulation. You chose to ignore objective reality because emotion overrode rational analysis. Emotion is all we have," Anakin snapped, rounding on Manhattan with desperate fury. "You stand there with your calculations and your detachment, judging beings who actually feel things. Maybe if you'd acted earlier, if you'd used your power when it mattered instead of philosophizing about consequences, none of this would have happened." The accusation struck Manhattan with unexpected force. Anakin was correct. His hesitation, his endless calculation of optimal outcomes, his refusal to commit until certainty seemed achievable, all of it had led to this moment where tragedy unfolded despite his foreknowledge. He had known, had seen the trap's shape, if not its complete mechanism, and he had waited, observed, calculated while probability streams collapsed toward catastrophe. "You're right," Manhattan said quietly. "I failed. My power proved insufficient because I lacked conviction to use it decisively. I am complicit in what happened here." Sidious watched this exchange with barely concealed satisfaction. The quantum god was broken, his omnipotence revealed as meaningless without will to exercise it, and Anakin was spiraling into rationalization, desperate for any justification that would allow him to live with what he'd done. "The Jedi Order must be dissolved," Sidious declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd already won. "They attempted to assassinate the Supreme Chancellor. This aggression cannot stand. I will issue executive orders placing all Jedi under military arrest pending investigation into their conspiracy." Manhattan's precognition suddenly cleared, Sidious's victory removing the probability obfuscation that had clouded future sight, and what he saw in the timeline that had just solidified made his atomic structure recoil with horror. Order 66 activating across the galaxy, Jedi murdered by their own troops, the temple burning, children executed in their sleep, survivors hunted across star systems by clone assassins and Force-sensitive inquisitors. The Republic transforming into empire, Sidious ruling for decades while Anakin, twisted into something called Vader, served as his enforcer, slaughtering anyone who remembered democracy, and underlying it all, trillions of beings suffering under authoritarian rule because one quantum god had been too cautious to prevent what he'd known was coming. "No," Manhattan said, and the single word carried weight that made reality itself tremble. "This ends now." He moved faster than human perception could track, his form blurring as matter reorganized with perfect precision. One moment he stood across the office. The next his hand was wrapped around Sidious's throat, lifting the Sith Lord from the floor with gentle but irresistible force. "You will not execute Order 66, Manhattan stated. "You will not transform this republic into your empire. You will not continue your manipulation of galactic civilization." Sidious struggled, dark side lightning erupting against Manhattan's atomic structure with everything the Sith Lord could channel. But where the initial confrontation had caused pain, now Manhattan simply absorbed the energy, his quantum consciousness learning to channel force lightning into harmless radiation that dissipated into Coruscant's atmosphere. "Kill me," Sidious gasped through constricted throat, "and you prove the Jedi's corruption. You prove that might makes right, that beings with power need not answer to law or democracy. You become the tyrant you claim to oppose." Manhattan paused, recognizing the trap within the trap. Executing Sidious would indeed validate authoritarian principles, that superior power justified imposed will. It would prove to Anakin and the galaxy that strength mattered more than law, that individuals could override collective decision-making through force. But allowing Sidious to live would permit genocide, would doom the Jedi and condemn the galaxy to decades of suffering under imperial tyranny. There was no calculation that resolved this dilemma, no optimal path that preserved both principles and prevented tragedy. He was forced to choose, and any choice would carry cost that calculation could never fully justify. Dr. Manhattan looked at Anakin, saw the young Jedi watching with expression mixing hope and horror, saw someone who needed to believe that power could be exercised responsibly, that choices could be made that weren't compromises with lesser evils. I am choosing, Manhattan said slowly, to accept the burden of consequences rather than permit tragedy I can prevent. This may make me tyrant. It may validate principles I find troubling, but observation without intervention has proven worse than imperfect action. His grip tightened incrementally, and Darth Sidious, orchestrator of galactic war, manipulator of destiny, the phantom menace that had haunted democracy for decades, began to disintegrate, not violently, not explosively, simply ceasing to exist as Manhattan's quantum consciousness reorganized Sidious's atomic structure into constituent elements that scattered harmlessly. The Sith Lord had time for one final expression, not fear, but satisfaction, as though even death at a quantum god's hands validated some deeper truth about power's nature. Then he was gone, and the dark side presence that had clouded Coruscant for decades lifted like fog before dawn. Manhattan released the empty space where Sidious had existed, his blue form dimming slightly as though the act of execution had diminished something fundamental in his nature. "You killed him," Anakin said, voice hollow with shock. "You just ended him." "I chose action over calculation," Manhattan replied. "I may have made the wrong choice, but I made a choice, and I will accept responsibility for whatever consequences follow." Alarms began blaring throughout the Senate building. Clone troopers were converging on the Chancellor's office, responding to reports of Jedi attack. And across the galaxy, in the absence of Order 66's transmission, millions of Jedi continued to serve alongside their clone companions, unaware of how close they'd come to extinction. Dr. Manhattan had saved them, had prevented genocide through decisive action. But as he looked at Anakin's devastated face, at Mace Windu's corpse lying amid the ruins of what had been the Supreme Chancellor's office, at the chaos his intervention had unleashed, he couldn't shake the certainty that saving the Jedi might have cost something equally precious, and he would not know the full price for years to come. The Jedi Temple burned, not with conventional fire, but with the chaos of political upheaval that consumed institutions as surely as flame consumed Durasteel. The Supreme Chancellor was dead, killed by an extra-dimensional entity during an attempted arrest. 4 Jedi Masters lay dead in the Chancellor's office, and the galaxy's most powerful warrior had stood paralyzed between 2 authorities he'd trusted, watching both betray the principles they claimed to serve. Dr. Manhattan floated above the temple's highest spire, his quantum consciousness perceiving the cascading consequences of his choice rippling across Coruscant like shock waves through water. The Senate had erupted into factional warfare, some members declaring the Jedi heroes who'd exposed Sith corruption, others branding them traitors who'd assassinated democracy's elected leader. The clone army stood in uncertain limbo, their biochips dormant, but their command structure decapitated with no chancellor to issue orders. Below him, in the temple's council chamber, the surviving Jedi Masters attempted to navigate catastrophe without precedent in their 1,000-generation history. "The Senate is demanding answers," Obi-Wan reported, his voice carrying exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. "Half the senators want us arrested for conspiracy. The other half want us granted emergency powers to maintain order. We've become the very thing we swore to prevent, a military force imposing our will on democratic government." Yoda sat in his traditional position, but his ancient frame seemed diminished, as though the weight of recent events had compressed his small form even further. "Failed we have, clouded by arrogance, blinded by certainty. The Sith Lord we sought lived beside us for decades and we sensed nothing. But we did expose him," Ki-Adi-Mundi countered. "Palpatine's crimes would have continued unchecked without Dr. Manhattan's intervention. Surely that counts for something." "Exposed him, yes," Yoda agreed softly. "Stopped him, yes. But at what cost? 4 masters dead, the Republic's government paralyzed, our order's reputation destroyed in the eyes of millions who saw us as religious extremists assassinating their elected leader." Manhattan materialized in the council chamber, his blue form casting strange light across the circular room. Every Jedi present felt his arrival as a void in the Force, an absence that defined itself through what it displaced rather than what it contained. The Senate is voting on emergency measures, Manhattan reported, his voice carrying information his quantum perception had gathered from a dozen simultaneous political sessions. Provisional Chancellor Massa Mehta is attempting to consolidate power by claiming Palpatine's authority. Senator Bail Organa is proposing Jedi oversight of government transition. Senator Orrin Free-Taa is calling for military action against the temple itself. Civil war, Plo Koon said grimly. We exposed one threat only to unleash another. The Republic is tearing itself apart. And the Separatists? Obi-Wan asked. Confused, Manhattan replied. Count Dooku received encoded instructions from Sidious before his death. But without their master's ongoing coordination, the Separatist leadership is fragmenting. Some factions propose peace negotiations. Others advocate continuing the war to exploit Republic chaos. Within 72 hours, the Separatist alliance will collapse into competing interests unless new leadership emerges. The Council absorbed this information with grim understanding. They'd won. Sidious was dead. Order 66 prevented. The Jedi Order intact. But victory felt hollow when the Republic they'd served was dissolving into factional warfare that might prove more destructive than any Sith plot. We must address the Senate, Mace Windu's recorded voice said through a holocron he'd prepared years earlier for precisely such constitutional crisis. The Council had activated it after his death, seeking guidance from their fallen leader. The Jedi serve democracy, not any individual leader. If our order's survival requires the Republic's dissolution, then we have already lost what we sought to protect. Yoda's ears drooped lower. Right, Master Windu was. Servants we are. Not rulers, never rulers. Then what do we do? Ki-Adi-Mundi demanded, frustration bleeding through Jedi calm. The Senate cannot govern itself. Without leadership, the Republic will fragment into 1,000 independent systems. Billions will die in the resulting chaos. All eyes turned to Dr. Manhattan, and he felt the weight of their expectations like gravitational force. They wanted him to solve this, to use his quantum omniscience to calculate optimal paths through political catastrophe. But Manhattan had learned the limits of calculation over the past week, had discovered that some problems resisted purely analytical solutions. I killed Sidious, Manhattan said slowly, because I chose to accept responsibility for consequences rather than permit tragedy through inaction. But that choice has created new problems I did not anticipate. Removing Sidious was necessary, but not sufficient. The Republic's government requires reconstruction, not merely the elimination of its corrupting influence. Can you help with that reconstruction? Obi-Wan asked. Can your abilities identify trustworthy leaders, detect corruption, ensure fair governance? Manhattan considered the question with uncomfortable recognition of its implications. I could. My quantum perception allows perfect surveillance. I could monitor every senator, every administrator, every military officer for signs of corruption or authoritarian ambition. I could impose transparency that would make democratic governance genuinely accountable. But, Yoda prompted, hearing the hesitation in Manhattan's voice, but such surveillance would itself be authoritarian, Manhattan admitted. A being with my power constantly observing, judging, potentially intervening, that is not democracy. That is benevolent dictatorship, differing from Sidious's empire only in stated intentions rather than operational structure. The Council fell silent, confronting the philosophical trap Manhattan articulated. They defeated the Sith Lord through power that exceeded conventional authority, and now that same power threatened to undermine the very democratic principles they'd fought to preserve. There must be another way, Obi-Wan insisted, some path that preserves both democracy and stability. Perhaps there is, a new voice said. Anakin Skywalker entered the council chamber, his presence immediately shifting the room's atmosphere. He'd been absent since Palpatine's death, sequestered in meditation chambers where he'd struggled with the knowledge that his moment of weakness had facilitated either genocide's prevention or tyrannicide, depending on perspective. Anakin, Obi-Wan said carefully, uncertain how his former Padawan would respond after witnessing his mentor's execution. We're glad you've come. The Council needs to stop trying to fix everything, Anakin interrupted, his voice carrying a weight of certainty that surprised everyone present. That was Palpatine's trap, making us believe that we had to control outcomes, that our wisdom and power meant we should impose solutions on democratic systems. But democracy requires trust that beings can govern themselves, even imperfectly. Yoda's eyes opened fully, studying Anakin with renewed interest. Grown you have. Wisdom in your words, I hear. I've had time to think, Anakin continued, moving to stand beside Dr. Manhattan, to really process what happened. Palpatine groomed me by making me feel special, making me believe that my power meant I deserved authority others didn't have. But power doesn't grant wisdom. If anything, it makes wisdom harder to achieve because you stop listening to people you can simply override. He turned to face Manhattan directly. You struggled with whether to act because you'd learned that power, without understanding, causes catastrophe. I pushed you to act because I believe conviction mattered more than certainty. We were both partially correct and partially wrong. Manhattan felt something shift in his quantum consciousness. Recognition that this young Jedi, who'd made catastrophic mistakes and carried impossible burdens, somehow understood truths that omniscience hadn't revealed. What do you propose? Manhattan asked. The Jedi withdraw from political authority, Anakin said firmly. We helped expose Sidious's corruption, but we don't replace his authority with our own. We allow the Senate to choose new leadership through democratic process, even if that process is messy and imperfect. And you, he gestured to Manhattan, you share what you've learned about the biochips, about Sidious's manipulation, about the clone army's true purpose. But then you step back. You give beings the information they need to make informed choices, but you don't make those choices for them. And if they choose poorly, Plo Koon challenged, if the Senate selects corrupt leadership, if the Republic slides into authoritarianism, despite our warnings, then we deal with those consequences when they arrive, Anakin replied. But we deal with them through persuasion, through demonstrating better alternatives, through serving as examples of the principles we claim to value, not through imposed solutions that treat democratic societies like children who need godlike supervision. The council exchanged glances, weighted with implications. What Anakin proposed was radical, a complete withdrawal from the political authority the Jedi Order had wielded for centuries. It meant trusting fallible beings to govern themselves even when the Jedi could clearly see better paths forward. It's a risk, Obi-Wan said slowly, a tremendous risk. All choices involve risk, Manhattan observed, and for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, he felt genuine certainty about a course of action. I have spent the past week calculating optimal outcomes, attempting to determine which intervention would produce maximum benefit with minimum harm. But Anakin is correct. That approach treats democratic beings as variables to be optimized rather than conscious entities with inherent right to self-determination. He moved to the chamber's center, his blue form brightening with renewed conviction. I will provide the Senate with complete information about Sidious's manipulations. I will testify to what I observed, present evidence of the biochips in the orchestrated war. But I will not impose solutions. I will not use my power to ensure any particular outcome beyond preventing immediate violence. The Republic's future must be chosen by its citizens, not calculated by an omniscient observer. Yoda rose from his seat, his small form somehow commanding despite its diminutive size. A great wisdom this is. Perhaps the greatest lesson the Force has taught us, that control is illusion, that trust is strength, that letting go is sometimes the most powerful choice we can make. The ancient master approached Manhattan, looking up at the towering blue figure with expression mixing gratitude and concern. Leave us, will you? When the crisis passes, when the Republic finds new stability. Manhattan processed the question, feeling its implications ripple through his quantum consciousness. Yoda was asking whether he intended to remain in this galaxy permanently or return to whatever existence he'd occupied before his accidental arrival. I don't know, Manhattan admitted. I came here by accident, but I've learned things I could not have discovered in my home universe. This galaxy's force, your philosophy of trust despite uncertainty, the way consciousness shapes reality through conviction rather than calculation, these are profound truths that challenge everything I thought I understood about existence. Then perhaps stay, you should, Yoda suggested gently. Much to teach us you have, much to learn you might. And companions on the journey we could be. beings who understand the burden of power, the weight of responsibility, the necessity of letting go. For the first time since his transformation decades ago, Dr. Manhattan felt something he thought lost forever: the possibility of genuine connection. Not the clinical observation of relationships, but actual participation in community with beings who saw him not as God or threat, but as fellow traveler struggling with similar questions. I will stay, Manhattan decided, at least until I understand whether my presence here serves benefit or merely adds complexity to already difficult situations. The council accepted this commitment, recognizing it as progress from a being who'd arrived claiming complete detachment. As they prepared to address the Senate and navigate the Republic's reconstruction, Manhattan remained in the chamber, his quantum consciousness processing lessons learned across the past week. He had come to this galaxy as a god, believing his power and perception granted him understanding beyond mortal comprehension. But he'd learned that omniscience without conviction was merely observation, that perfect knowledge without willingness to act produced paralysis rather than wisdom. The force, that mystical energy he couldn't directly perceive or manipulate, operated on principles that defied his analytical frameworks. It granted its users the ability to shape reality through trust, through passion, through commitment, despite uncertainty. These were qualities his transformation had stripped away, qualities he'd convinced himself were weaknesses rather than strengths. But Anakin, Ahsoka, and the Jedi Council had shown him that power without emotional investment was merely potential, impressive but ultimately sterile, that choosing imperfect action was often superior to calculated inaction, that accepting consequences was not weakness, but the very definition of moral responsibility. Across Coruscant, emergency Senate sessions debated the Republic's future. On Camino, medical teams began extracting biochips from clone troopers who wept with relief at learning their loyalty had been violated. Throughout Separatist space, factory worlds halted droid production as leadership fragmented without Sidious's coordination. And in the Jedi Temple, an ancient order confronted the uncomfortable truth that their power had blinded them to wisdom available to less mighty beings. The galaxy would survive, would adapt, would choose its own path forward through democratic process that would certainly be messy, probably be imperfect, but would at least be genuinely chosen rather than imposed. Dr. Manhattan had saved the Jedi Order by killing Darth Sidious. But whether that salvation proved worthwhile would depend on what the Order did with its unexpected continuation, whether they learned from near extinction to serve rather than control, to guide rather than command, to trust rather than calculate. And as he floated above the temple watching dawn break over Coruscant, Manhattan realized he was asking himself the same questions. His power could solve countless problems, prevent innumerable tragedies, impose optimal outcomes on chaotic systems. But perhaps the greatest wisdom lay in recognizing that some problems required messy organic solutions rather than precise quantum calculations. The democracy's value emerged not from producing perfect outcomes, but from honoring the principle that conscious beings deserved to determine their own fates, even when those fates were uncertain, even when those choices might prove wrong, even when a god could clearly see better paths forward, but lacked the moral authority to force beings down those paths against their will. This was the lesson the Force had taught him, that conviction despite uncertainty, trust despite imperfect knowledge, and action despite consequences were not weaknesses to be overcome, but essential components of meaningful existence. Dr. Manhattan had arrived in this galaxy as a quantum god. He was beginning to understand he might leave as something more profound, a being who'd rediscovered what it meant to be human. 6 months had transformed the galaxy in ways both profound and subtle. The Republic endured, though scarred by revelations of Sidious's decades-long manipulation. Senator Bail Organa had been elected interim chancellor through emergency protocols, his first act establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate Sith infiltration of governmental institutions. The Separatist alliance had fragmented as predicted, with most corporate entities negotiating individual treaties rather than continuing coordinated warfare. The Clone Wars were ending not with climactic battle, but with exhausted diplomacy, messy, imperfect, but genuinely chosen by beings who'd learned the cost of manufactured conflict. Dr. Manhattan stood on the same industrial platform where Anakin had first challenged his detachment, watching Coruscant's eternal cityscape with perspective transformed by half a year's experience. His quantum consciousness still perceived reality at atomic scales, still saw past and probable futures simultaneously. But now those observations carried emotional context he'd thought lost forever. He felt the city's pulse, 5 trillion beings pursuing individual desires that collectively form civilization. Felt the weight of their choices, their struggles, their small victories against entropy and chaos. For the first time since his transformation, he recognized that observation enriched by empathy produced understanding that pure analysis could never achieve. "Still here," a familiar voice said behind him. Anakin Skywalker approached, no longer the desperate warrior who'd stood paralyzed between conflicting authorities. The past 6 months had aged him in ways beyond mere chronology. His face carried lines of someone who'd confronted personal failure and chosen growth rather than rationalization. "I am still here," Manhattan confirmed. "Your Jedi Council's offer of companionship proved compelling. I have learned things I could not have discovered alone." "We've learned from you too," Anakin replied, moving to stand beside the blue figure. "The biochip evidence, the surveillance recordings, the financial documentation, it changed everything. The Senate couldn't deny what you'd observed, couldn't dismiss it as Jedi manipulation or religious extremism. Sometimes truth needs a witness outside the conflict to be believed." Manhattan nodded, his luminous form dimming slightly with something like humility. "Though my intervention killed 4 Jedi Masters and destabilized your government, the optimal outcome remains elusive even with hindsight. Masters Teen, Kalar, Fisto, and Windu died because Sidious was more dangerous than we anticipated," Anakin corrected gently. "Their deaths aren't your responsibility. If anything, your presence prevented far greater tragedy. Without you, Order 66 would have executed thousands of Jedi. The galaxy would be suffering under Sidious's empire. Our losses, however painful, are a fraction of what would have been." "Statistical probability suggests you are correct," Manhattan said. "But statistics do not adequately capture the weight of individual deaths. Master Windu's absence from your council, the wisdom he would have provided during Reconstruction, these are losses that ripple through time in ways my precognition struggles to quantify." Anakin smiled, and it was the expression of someone who'd learned to accept imperfect outcomes rather than demanding impossible certainty. "You sound more human than when you arrived, less like a quantum calculator, more like someone who actually cares about results. Your colleague Ahsoka suggested I feel more than I admit," Manhattan reflected. "She may have been correct. Observation without emotional investment is merely data collection. Understanding requires caring about what observations mean." They stood in comfortable silence, 2 beings whose power exceeded conventional limits, but who'd learned that strength without wisdom produced catastrophe. Below them, the city continued its eternal rhythm, speeders flowing through aerial traffic lanes, beings pursuing commerce and connection, democracy functioning through 10,000 small choices rather than imposed design. "What will you do now?" Anakin asked eventually. "The war's ending. The Republic's stabilizing. Your purpose here seems fulfilled." Manhattan considered the question with his quantum consciousness, perceiving multiple potential futures spreading before him like probability fractals. In some timelines, he remained in the Star Wars galaxy, serving as advisor and observer. In others, he attempted to return to his home universe, seeking the reality where Dr. Jonathan Osterman had begun his transformation. In still others, he explored the broader multiverse, searching for meaning in existence that transcended any single galaxy's concerns. "I am uncertain," Manhattan admitted, and the confession carried liberation rather than weakness. "For decades, I believed uncertainty was a problem to be solved through perfect knowledge, but your force operates on different principles. It rewards trust despite uncertainty, conviction despite incomplete information. Perhaps my future should be chosen rather than calculated." "That's very Jedi of you," Anakin observed with gentle humor. "Welcome to making decisions based on faith rather than certainty. It's terrifying and liberating simultaneously." A notification chimed on Anakin's comlink, Obi-Wan summoning him to the council chamber for discussion about Jedi's future role in galactic governance. The young knight nodded acknowledgement, then paused before departing. Manhattan, thank you for acting when you were afraid to act, for trusting us when you had every reason to remain detached, for showing us that even gods can learn to be better than their power suggests. Then he was gone, leaving Manhattan alone with thoughts that had grown increasingly complex over 6 months of genuine connection with beings who'd welcomed him despite his alienness. The quantum entity closed his eyes, unnecessary for perception, but meaningful for introspection, and reflected on transformation that exceeded mere atomic reorganization. He had arrived in this galaxy believing himself beyond emotion, beyond connection, beyond the concerns that motivated lesser beings. But the Jedi had shown him that lesser beings often possessed wisdom that omniscience couldn't access, that Ahsoka's passionate conviction carried truth his calculations missed, that Anakin's willingness to risk failure produced outcomes careful analysis predicted impossible, that Yoda's trust in the Force represented sophisticated understanding of reality's fundamental nature, rather than primitive superstition. The Force itself remained mysterious, energy he could observe but not manipulate, principles he could analyze but not fully comprehend. It operated through consciousness in ways that defied quantum mechanics, allowing beings to impose desired outcomes onto probability through will alone. It was simultaneously mystical and practical, spiritual and pragmatic, unknowable and intimately present. Perhaps that paradox was the point. Perhaps existence required mysteries that resisted complete understanding, questions that remained perpetually open, truths that revealed themselves through experience rather than calculation. Dr. Manhattan opened his eyes and made a choice. He would remain in this galaxy for now, would continue learning from beings whose power paled beside his own, but whose wisdom exceeded his understanding, would serve as witness to democracy's messy reconstruction, offering truth when requested, but solutions only when truly necessary, would explore whether a being who'd lost his humanity through transformation might rediscover it through connection with those who'd never lost sight of what mattered. His quantum consciousness perceived multiple futures branching from this decision, some triumphant, others tragic, most simply continuing the complex work of existing in universe that resisted simple categorization. But for the first time since his transformation, he embraced that uncertainty rather than attempting to collapse it through perfect knowledge. Across the city and the Jedi Temple, masters gathered to debate questions that would shape their order's future. On distant worlds, clone troopers learned to think for themselves without biochip compulsion. In negotiation chambers throughout the galaxy, former enemies discovered that peace required harder work than war, but produced more meaningful outcomes. And in the vast darkness between stars, the Force flowed through all things, connecting past to future through present choices that consciousness made despite imperfect understanding. Dr. Manhattan teleported away from the industrial platform, his form dissolving into quantum probability before reconstituting in the temple gardens, where Ahsoka practiced lightsaber forms. The young Jedi sensed his arrival through the void he created, and she smiled with genuine warmth at the blue figure who'd learned that observation without participation was merely loneliness disguised as wisdom. "Want to spar?" she offered, igniting her dual blades with practiced ease. "I've been working on techniques specifically designed to fight opponents who can see the future. Seems like good training for someone who exists outside linear time." Manhattan observed the invitation with something approximating amusement. Emotion he'd thought burned away by atomic transformation, but which apparently remained accessible through connection with beings who refused to accept his claimed detachment. "I cannot manipulate the Force," Manhattan pointed out. "Lightsaber combat would be profoundly unbalanced." "Then don't use your quantum powers," Ahsoka countered. "Just your physical form and normal reflexes. Make it fair. Make it interesting." The challenge carried implications beyond mere combat practice. She was inviting him to limit himself voluntarily, to experience existence through constraints rather than omnipotence, to discover whether choosing limitation might produce richer experience than exercising unlimited power. Manhattan materialized a simple metal staff from reorganized atmospheric particles. Not quantum manipulation of fundamental forces, just conventional matter manipulation any industrial replicator could achieve. He adopted a defensive stance taught in martial arts schools on Earth decades ago, muscle memory buried beneath quantum consciousness, but not entirely forgotten. Very well, he said. Teach me what the Force knows that calculation does not. Their sparring began with careful exchanges, testing reflexes and reading patterns. Ahsoka's lightsabers hummed through the garden air, their plasma blades leaving ion trails that Manhattan's atomic vision perceived as beautiful geometric patterns. His staff deflected rather than attacked, defensive strategy that required predicting opponent movement through observation rather than precognition. And in that moment of voluntary limitation, Dr. Manhattan discovered something profound, that choosing to be less than omnipotent created space for genuine challenge, authentic uncertainty, meaningful engagement with existence. He had spent decades exercising godlike power in isolation, and it had produced only detachment and alienation. Now he sparred with a 16-year-old Jedi using conventional techniques rather than quantum manipulation, and the experience carried richness that omnipotence had never achieved. Perhaps this was the ultimate lesson the Force had been teaching him since arrival, that power's purpose was not domination or control, but connection, that the greatest strength lay not in imposing optimal outcomes, but in participating authentically with beings who made their own flawed choices, that even gods needed communities if they wanted existence to mean something beyond mere calculation. The sparring continued as Coruscant's sun tracked across the sky, or rather, as the planet's rotation created the illusion of solar movement, though Manhattan appreciated the poetic expression regardless of astronomical accuracy. Around them, the Jedi Temple hummed with activity as an ancient order adapted to new roles in a galaxy that had nearly lost them. And Dr. Manhattan, quantum god who'd arrived by accident and stayed by choice, learned that coming home didn't require returning to where you'd begun. Sometimes home was wherever beings saw your true nature, power and weakness, strength and vulnerability, omniscience and uncertainty, and welcomed you anyway. Sometimes home was a galaxy far, far away, guided by mystical forces you couldn't fully comprehend, populated by beings whose wisdom exceeded their power. Sometimes home was simply choosing to stay when you could leave, choosing connection over isolation, choosing to matter to beings who mattered to you. Dr. Manhattan had crossed dimensional barriers seeking understanding. He'd found it not through perfect knowledge but through imperfect relationships with beings who taught him that the greatest mysteries resisted calculation. And in learning to embrace that mystery, he'd finally discovered what it meant to be alive. The galaxy turned, as galaxies do, indifferent to the dramas unfolding across its spiral arms. But the beings inhabiting that galaxy were not indifferent. They remembered the quantum god who'd appeared during their darkest hour, who'd struggled with whether to act, who'd ultimately chosen intervention despite uncertainty about consequences. The Jedi Order survived, diminished but intact, their near-extinction teaching humility that centuries of authority had obscured. They served the Republic as advisors rather than commanders, offering wisdom without demanding obedience, trusting that democracy functioned best when beings govern themselves even imperfectly. The clone army disbanded gradually, with soldiers offered citizenship and autonomy they'd never known during their manufactured existence. Some remained in military service, others pursued civilian lives, all finally free to choose rather than simply obey. CT-555 said the embryo Manhattan had observed on Camino would grow to become one of the Republic's finest advocates for clone rights, living proof that beings created for war could choose peace. Anakin Skywalker never fell to the dark side. Palpatine's death removed the corrupting influence that had been systematically positioned to exploit his greatest fears. He married Padme openly once the Jedi Order revised their doctrine on attachment, recognizing that connection was strength rather than weakness. Their twins, Luke and Leia, would grow up in a galaxy that had confronted authoritarianism and chosen democracy despite its frustrating imperfections. And Dr. Manhattan remained neither fully of the galaxy nor entirely apart from it. He observed and occasionally intervened, his quantum perception providing truth that beings struggling with political complexity desperately needed. But he never imposed solutions, never used his godlike power to override democratic choices, never forgot the lessons learned through 6 months of genuine connection with beings who taught him that wisdom resided in unexpected places. The Force continued to flow through all things, its mysteries intact despite quantum observation. Manhattan never gained ability to manipulate it directly, never fully understood its principles, but he learned to respect what he couldn't quantify, to trust what calculation couldn't capture, to accept that some truths revealed themselves through faith rather than analysis. In the end, the quantum god who'd arrived by accident became something more precious, a friend, a companion, a fellow traveler who'd discovered that even omniscience needed community if existence was to carry meaning beyond mere observation. The galaxy far, far away had been saved not by perfect power perfectly applied, but by imperfect beings making difficult choices despite uncertainty, by Jedi who'd learned humility, by a young warrior who'd confronted his own capacity for terrible mistakes, by a quantum entity who'd rediscovered his humanity through connection with those who'd never lost sight of what mattered. And somewhere in the space between stars, the Force whispered approval, not because events had unfolded optimally, but because consciousness had chosen growth over stagnation, trust over control, connection over isolation. Some stories end with triumph, others with tragedy. This one ended with something more difficult and more valuable. The recognition that existence required accepting uncertainty, that strength meant choosing action despite imperfect knowledge, and that even gods needed to learn that coming home sometimes meant finding yourself in places you'd never imagined belonging. Dr. Manhattan had crossed dimensions, seeking understanding. He'd found it in a galaxy guided by the Force, taught by beings whose power paled beside his own, but whose wisdom illuminated truths quantum consciousness couldn't access alone. And in learning to embrace mystery rather than demanding certainty, he'd finally become more than the sum of his atomic structure. He'd become someone whose existence meant something beyond calculation,